In 1985, several tweens were playing a game of hide-and-seek in the park. At the time, 11-year-old Jesse Morgan was one of them. He said that during the game, another tween found him and told him that he had found an abandoned metal drum in the woods. It was a deep blue 55-gallon metal drum with a slight rust. They called out to the other tweens and walked into the woods together. Then, in order to show off his bravery, the tween who found the metal drum walked up to it and pushed it over with force. Just in 1 second, a nauseating smell of decay wafted out. Like the other tweens, Morgan was also frightened by the smell, and they all scattered in a panic. 4 months later, 2 hunters on their way to hunt in the same park and found the abandoned metal drum. The metal drum was lying on its side on the ground, emitting an extremely complex and unbearable odor. This time, out of curiosity, one of the hunters approached and reached out to open the lid of the metal drum. However, a human foot bone fell out from inside. The park is Bear Brook State Park, located in Allenstown, New Hampshire. Bear Brook State Park is a vibrant natural paradise, home to many wild animals, including a variety of birds, moose, and coyotes. Realizing that this was a case of body dumping, the 2 hunters were horrified, and they immediately called the police. Inside the metal drum were 2 decomposed remains. One was an adult woman, and the other was a little girl. Even though they were wrapped in plastic and kept away from the air, their remains had already become skeletonized. The autopsy showed that both people died from a hard hit, and it looks like they died between 1978 and 1981. In the early stages of the investigation, the local police widely publicized the case across most regions in the United States and Canada. But even after getting hundreds of tips and putting in a lot of manpower and money, the police could not figure out who the real perpetrator was, or even the victims' real ages and identities. Later on, the 2 victims were buried in a cemetery in Allenstown. Their tombstones read, "Here are the remains of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl aged 8 to 10, whose identities are known only to God." As time went on, Bear Brook State Park slowly but surely went back to its usual calm atmosphere. However, in May 9, 2000, about 15 years later, a second abandoned metal drum was found, containing the remains of 2 little girls. This second metal drum was only 100 yards away from the first one, and the cause of death for the 2 girls was also blunt force trauma. Clearly, all 4 victims were killed by the same perpetrator, and based on the degree of decomposition, the police were certain that all 4 murders occurred around the same time. However, since it's been so long since the crimes, the victims' remains are pretty much just bones, which makes the investigation really slow. Back to December 1999, when a man named Larry Vanner met a female chemist named Yoon-Soon Jun in California. In June 2002, Yoon-Soon Jun, who was in her 40s, disappeared without a trace. Nobody knew where she was, except for Larry, who was aware of her location. Consequently, the police brought Larry to the interrogation room for questioning and took his fingerprints. Several days later, police searched Yoon-Soon Jun's residence in Richmond, California, including the entire house and a garage. At that time, a corner of the garage was piled high with cat litter. An investigator casually moved it around, and then a dismembered woman's foot appeared. Clearly, this was Yoon-Soon Jun's dismembered foot. She had already been murdered. In November 2002, Larry was arrested by the police. In addition, the police had found something shocking. Larry's fingerprints matched those of a guy named Curtis Kimball. Back in 1985, he was arrested for drunk driving and endangering a little girl. And in 1986, he abandoned the little girl in a mobile home park in Scotts Valley, California, under the alias Gordon Jensen. Until his identity was uncovered, he had been wanted for child abandonment. In 2003, with 2 aliases, Kimball stood in court and openly admitted his crimes, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. His confession shocked everyone, especially a police officer named Grunheid. She believed that Kimball chose to plead guilty because he thought that by doing so, she would stop investigating his past. According to information provided by Grunheid and her team, Kimball's criminal record began in 1985. That year, he was arrested under the name Kimball after a car accident in Cypress, California. At the time, a girl named Lisa was with him. Later on, he was charged with drunk driving and endangering the welfare of a child. Since he failed to appear in court, a warrant was also issued for his arrest. In January 1986, he and Lisa lived in a mobile home park in Scotts Valley, California. There, he worked as a handyman under the name Gordon Jensen. Richard and Catherine, an elderly couple who also lived in the park, noticed that Gordon was not taking care of Lisa at all, so they took it upon themselves to look after her. Later on, the couple wanted their daughter to adopt Lisa and took her to Southern California. However, there Lisa revealed to them that she had been abused, so the elderly couple called the police. In June 1986, the man escaped from the mobile home park in the name of Gordon, and the police issued an arrest warrant for him. In March 1989, Kimball, alias Green Mockerman, was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison because his fingerprints linked him to Gordon. He was released on parole in October 1990. Later on, in 1999, he reappeared in California under the name Larry. In 2003, Lisa, in her 20s, approached the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, hoping to find her biological parents. Initially, everyone assumed that Kimball was her biological father, but DNA testing confirmed that Kimball was not her father, leaving the case at an impasse. In 2013, Peder Headley of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was assigned to handle Lisa's case. At the end of 2014, Lisa expressed to Peder her desire to find her biological parents. Several months later, with the help of genealogist Barbara, Lisa located her grandfather, Armand, who lived in New Hampshire. As Armand recounted the story, the truth about Lisa's origins finally came to light. Lisa was born in 1981, and her mother was a woman named Denise. And in reality, her real name was Dawn, not Lisa. Armand recalled that after Denise left her husband, she was with a man named Bob Evans. Around Thanksgiving in 1981, Evans said he owed a lot of money, so they had to leave Manchester. By Christmas, Armand had planned to invite Denise and her family to celebrate the holiday, but they had already left. From that point on, the man never saw his daughter and granddaughter again. Later, the police showed him a photo of Kimball, and he immediately recognized him as Evans, who had taken his daughter away. So the police started looking into Evans. After talking with some people who knew about it, they found out that in the late 1970s, Evans had worked as an electrician and handyman at a campground store in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. At this point, the victims of the Bear Brook murders had not yet been identified. At first, the police thought Denise was the grown woman. However, the DNA testing revealed no connection between Lisa and her. So the police tried another test using Evans' DNA, which successfully matched one of the victims, a girl who was 2 or 4 years old. Later, in 2015, investigators used the DNA test to confirm that the grown woman was the mother of the other 2 girls. In the late 1970s, he lived in New Hampshire under the name Evans. Around 1984, he lived in California under the names Kimball, Gary, and Gordon. In 2002, he murdered Yoon Jun under the name Larry. Kimball, Larry, Gordon, Evans, and even Gary. Although the police believed that this man was a serial killer responsible for the Bear Brook murders and Denise's death, the most critical point was that no one knew which identity was his real one, nor did anyone understand his past. Finally, in 2017, Barbara, through genetic genealogy and genealogical websites, uncovered the true identity of the serial killer. His name is Peder Rasmussen, born on December 23, 1943, in Denver, Colorado. The police also found Terry's daughter Diane, who works as a records clerk at a police department in Illinois. In the interview, she recalled that in the 1960s, her father served in the U.S. Navy. And in 1968, her parents got married in Hawaii and had 4 children. According to her mother, in 1975, Terry was arrested for a serious assault, after which she left him with their 4 children. Around 1976, Terry showed up at their house with an unidentified woman, and upon seeing this woman, her mother decided to divorce him. When Diane found out that Terry was a serial killer, she said, If my mom hadn't left my dad, the one who might have died could have been me. Although the true identity of the serial killer had been uncovered, the identities of the 4 victims had yet to be confirmed. However, not long after, a woman named Heath provided an extremely important clue. She was a librarian and an internet detective who had a keen interest in the Bear Brook murders and had always hoped to uncover the true identities of the victims. In October 2018, she discovered an internet post from 1999. In the post, a man was trying to find his half-sister named Sarah, who was born in Hawaiian Gardens, California. In those days, her father was serving in the Marine Corps. However, on Thanksgiving Day in 1978, Sarah's mother, 24-year-old Marlies, had an argument with her own mother and then left home with her 2 daughters, 1-year-old Sarah and 6-year-old Marie, heading to New Hampshire. From that point on, they lost contact with their family. Later, Heath contacted a relative of Sarah, who mentioned that the likely reason Marlies left home was that she had married a man named Terry. Soon after, Heath found out that Terry had been living in New Hampshire under the name Bob Evans. But his wife was not Marlies, was a woman named Elizabeth Evans. Like Marlies, she was also accompanied by 2 children. In May 1980, Elizabeth appeared in a legal document. Later on, she and her children mysteriously vanished, and shortly thereafter, Terry left New Hampshire as well. Heath realized that these clues fit together logically. For instance, Elizabeth was likely an alias for Marlies, and their ages matched those of 3 of the Bear Brook murder victims, and their familial relationships had also been confirmed by the police. After uncovering this information, she shared her findings with Peder, the detective who had helped Lisa search for her biological parents. On June 6, 2019, investigators from New Hampshire held a press conference, confirming that the true identities of the 3 victims were Marlies, Marie, and Sarah, who had gone missing years ago, and that their killer was Terry. Several months later, the funerals for Marlies and Marie were held again in Allenstown, and their tombstones were inscribed with their names. Diane, Terry's daughter, was invited to the funeral. She said, "I don't know if I can make up for my father's sins. They told me, 'How do you make up for something like this?' It's not your fault." She added, "Because of my father, they lost their sister and niece. What ties us together is the terrible thing that happened here, but they treat me like they would treat their sister." Sarah was buried in Connecticut, closer to her father's family. And although we all knew the 4th victim was Terry's daughter, her identity remained unconfirmed until this year, when a team of genetic genealogists, through advanced DNA testing, genealogical analysis, and birth records, finally identified the 4th victim as a girl named Ree, born in 1976, whose mother was the long-missing Pepper Reed. This woman, Pepper, was last seen around Christmas in 1975. Before she had given birth to Ree, she left Texas secretly without informing her family. And based on timeline, her time of death is around the end of 1976 or 1977. Even though the truth came out, Terry had already died on December 28, 2010, in the High Desert State Prison. Over the years, he had been involved in murders, kidnappings, and deceptions across multiple states under various aliases. Looking at the many murders he committed, it's clear that he didn't target strangers. He just went after women and children who believed in and loved him. Society always thinks of police officers, prosecutors, judges, lawyers, and teachers as having high moral standards and idealized images. For instance, police officers are seen as embodiments of justice, and teachers are regarded as disseminators of knowledge and guides of morality. However, real life is far more complex than this idealized picture. It's important not to get too caught up in the prestige of any profession. In any field, there will always be people who fail to meet the standards and break the rules. Some police officers will take bribes while some teachers will mistreat their students. Norbert Hans Polke was a police officer who not only killed 3 innocent victims but also murdered his entire family. There are various speculations about his motives for the killings. Some people believe that it was his overwhelming debt that led him down this path. Others speculate that his daughter's brain tumor was the cause, and that being unable to afford her treatment plunged him into despair and agony. But whatever his motives may be, he must be held fully accountable for his crimes. On September 15, 1951, Norbert was born into an ordinary family in Stuttgart, West Germany. It is said that his parents had fled from East Germany to West Germany. This experience left the family rather unpopular in society, where they were labeled as indecent. In those days, prices in West Germany were soaring, food supplies were scarce, housing conditions were poor, and unemployment and homelessness were common. In order to ease the family's financial burden, children often took part-time jobs after school, such as delivering newspapers. Although Norbert's childhood life was not disclosed, his life was similar to this way. In 1968, after Norbert's parents divorced, he moved with his mother to Strumpfelbach, Baden-Württemberg, where he tried to become a business apprentice but was eventually dismissed for his repeated unexplained absences. Time flew by, and soon it was 1971. At 20 years old, Norbert stood at a crossroads. After some contemplation, he decided to become a police officer. He threw himself into the job, and his dedication was quickly rewarded with a series of promotions. In his spare time, Norbert also found love. He married a gentle and kind-hearted wife and had 2 sons, leading an ordinary life. The police officer had a particular habit. Every time he passed by a lottery shop on his way home from work, he would buy a ticket. Having grown up in poverty, Norbert always harbored dreams of turning small bets into big wins. In the early 1980s, he won the lottery, a prize of 30,000 marks. Back then, the winnings were enough to buy an apartment near the city. Not long after, Norbert's wife also gave birth to a daughter. Then, the money and the arrival of his daughter sparked an idea in Norbert's mind. In reality, he had always harbored a dream of building a house of his own. The lottery winnings and his growing family fueled his desire to realize this dream. He eagerly began to plan the construction and prepared to move his family to the countryside. However, once the house was completed, Norbert had not only exhausted all the lottery money, but also used up the loan he had taken from the bank, leaving him with a debt of 300,000 marks. The huge debt loomed over him like a mountain, plunging him into an unprecedented predicament. Although in 1982 he was transferred to Mühlhausen am Neckar's Canine Division as a high-ranking sergeant, his salary increased, but it was merely a drop in the bucket, far from enough to repay his debts. Later, in March 1984, another disaster struck the already heavily indebted family. His daughter, a 3-year-old girl, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Faced with exorbitant medical expenses, Norbert was unable to pay. He could only watch helplessly as his daughter passed away in agony. And this event had a devastating impact on this family and became the turning point for Norbert's descent into crime. Firstly, Norbert's salary was entirely insufficient to cover his huge financial gap. He needed money, a large amount of money, to prevent his life from collapsing. However, legitimate means could not meet his urgent needs. Thus, he made a reckless decision to rob banks. As a police officer who had worked in the area for a decade, he was intimately familiar with everything there. He knew every street and corner and was thoroughly familiar with police procedures and investigation methods. But to carry out this plan, he had to be flawless, leaving no useful clues behind. He had a weapon and an escape route, so what he needed was a car. One car that did not belong to himself and anyone he knew. So, how to get a stranger's car? Theft? Norbert chose a method that was both simple and extreme. On May 3, 1984, he lingered near a highway rest stop in the Marbach area, waiting for the right person to carry out his plan. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a car pulled into the gas station. The car's owner was a sales engineer named Siegfried. After stopping the car, he opened the door and stepped out to refuel. However, Norbert pulled out a gun from behind his back and, without warning, shot Siegfried in the face. He grabbed a hammer, shattered Siegfried's car window, climbed into the vehicle, started it, and drove away from the scene. Not long after, someone discovered Siegfried's body with a gunshot wound to the face and found his car was gone. Around 12:25 that same morning, Norbert arrived at a bank in Erbstetten. There, he broke the counter window with a hammer and stole 5,000 marks. Although the bank staff managed to activate the alarm, Norbert had already fled in panic before the police arrived. In the days following the robbery, the bank employees endeavored to recall the perpetrator's physical characteristics. They described him as a man between 35 and 40 years old, with straight light brown hair, tall and slender, and dressed in a blue suit. Meanwhile, investigators collected bloodstains from the bank, which were left behind when Norbert injured his hand while smashing the counter window. After the robbery, the police discovered an abandoned car a few hundred meters from the scene of Siegfried's death, and not long after, it was identified as his car. However, certain key details aroused the suspicion of the police, leading them to suspect the bank robber was likely also Siegfried's murderer. The car had mysteriously disappeared before the robbery and then reappeared after the robbery. Moreover, both the bank counter window and the car window were shattered with a hammer. As time went on, the police established a special investigative committee comprising 20 top investigators to focus on the case. They also issued a public warning, urging everyone to be vigilant, as the murderer was likely to use a firearm ruthlessly. However, despite an extensive investigation, the police still failed to apprehend the murderer. 5,000 marks were a mere drop in the ocean compared to Norbert's debt of 300,000. Sensing that the police investigation had hit a dead end, he turned to crime once more. In December of the same year, Wevy, a 37-year-old British expatriate living in Nuremberg, was resting at the parking lot in Grossbutt War. He was preparing to travel to Switzerland to spend Christmas with his parents, but on the way, he was attacked and killed by a stranger. Obviously, the murderer was Norbert, who had initially intended only to steal Wevy's car. Compared to his first crime, he took more time to conceal the body, dragging Wevy's remains to a nearby grove and covering them with leaves. A week later, he used the stolen vehicle in a bank robbery in Klebron, from which he made off with 79,000 marks. Several days after the robbery, a passerby discovered Wevy's body. During the investigation, the police found a crucial clue: a cartridge case nearly identical to the one from Siegfried's murder. It is well known, each bullet is like a unique footprint left at the crime scene, imparting specific marks and grooves on its trajectory. The ballistics department, well aware of this, conducted an extensive analysis, examining over 12,000 weapon models in an attempt to find the key clue. In those days, the investigation mounted by the German police was unprecedented. They mobilized a significant number of officers to conduct a thorough investigation of 1,400 individuals, questioning them about possible involvement. Despite the extensive scope, no one fully matched the witness description of the murderer. But, fortunately, investigators got obtained several promising leads. The murderer killed to obtain a car for a quick getaway after the robbery. He used a hammer to break into vehicles and bank windows not to harm people, which indicated that his purpose was very clear. He just wanted money. In addition, the weapon used in all the killings was the same, a standard pistol widely used by the West German police and security personnel. Obviously, the murderer had connections within the police or security personnel. On July 22, 1985, Wilfried, a 27-year-old electrician, was found dead, his death identical to that of the previous victims. On the very same day, Norbert struck again, attempting to rob a bank. However, this time he was unsuccessful because the bank was surrounded by police. His plan was foiled, forcing him to flee in panic. Wilfried's death had the police on edge. As time went on, an unsettling rumor began to spread. The serial killer was likely a police officer. Amidst this tense atmosphere, the police even mistakenly arrested an Italian agent. In 1985, West Germany saw over 1,600 politically motivated bombings, arson attacks, murders, and other violent crimes. On September 29th, a bomb threat was reported at the Ludwigsburg railway station. While searching for bombs, the police found a police uniform in a locker, stained with blood. Later, the uniform was traced to Detective Chief Superintendent Norbert, a police officer of 14 years in Stuttgart. When questioned about why the uniform was left there, Norbert replied that he had attended a funeral. However, after investigating his whereabouts, they found that he had not attended any funeral recently. The only funeral he had attended was in 1984, his daughter's, who had died of a brain tumor. On October 14th, Norbert applied for sick leave. Several days later, the police arrived at his house, intending to question him about the murders and robberies. When they knocked on the door, there was no response. Fearing that Norbert might have fled, they forcibly entered. However, the sight inside shocked all the officers. Norbert's wife was lying in the bathroom, shot twice in the head, and his son, Adrian, was found dead in one of the bedrooms. On October 23rd, 3 days later, Norbert and his other son were found dead in a car at a village near Brindisi, Italy. Later, it was confirmed that Norbert's pistol was the murder weapon used in the killings, and the deaths of him and his family were ruled as suicide. With this, the case was finally closed. In the end, although Norbert's tragedy had come to an end, his name and his story remained in the places he had hurt. In the 20th century, when hippie culture was popular in Europe and the United States, there was a travel line called the Hippie Trail. In those days, drawn to the religions and philosophies of the East, hippies followed this line across the Eurasian continent, starting from Western Europe, passing through Istanbul, crossing the Middle East, and finally arriving in, India and Nepal. However, the hippie trail also caught the attention of a serial killer, Charles Sorbry, known as the Serpent. He and his criminal accomplices used hitchhiking, drugs, and lies as bait to commit a series of brutal and heinous robbery and murder cases there. April 6, 1944, Charles was born in Saigon, Indochina Union, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in 1976 and is located in Vietnam. His father was a Sindhi from India, and his mother was a Vietnamese woman with French citizenship. Charles' childhood was full of ups and downs. His parents were never married, and his father ruthlessly denied any paternal relationship with him. But fate did not completely abandon Charles. Later, Charles' mother married a Frenchman, a French army lieutenant stationed in the Indian colony. Initially, both his mother and stepfather were extremely caring towards him, taking him along whether they were in Southeast Asia or back in France. It was during these years that Charles grew up in a stable environment. In 1959, when he was 15 years old, with the help of his stepfather, his name was officially changed to Charles. But it's common knowledge that stepchildren can have a big impact on the birth of new life within a family. Charles was clearly the surplus one, and his emotional needs gradually began to be ignored by his mother and stepfather. During this time, he got into some small-time trouble. In 1963, he was first sent to prison for burglary and served his time in the Poissy prison near Paris. In those dark days, Charles received special favors from the prison officials who allowed him to read books in his cell. It was also during this time that Charles met Felix, a young man from a wealthy family. Felix was one of the prison volunteers at the time. Every week, he would come to the prison to help the inmates write letters, resolve simple legal issues, and provide companionship. Charles, with his charm and lies, quickly became good friends with Felix, who even wanted to help him reconcile with his parents, though with limited success. After being paroled, Charles moved in with Felix. There, Charles began to navigate between the high society and the underworld of Paris, amassing his wealth through a series of burglaries and frauds. Meanwhile, he met Chantal, a young Parisian girl from a conservative family. Shortly after they met, they confirmed their romantic relationship. However, on the very day Charles proposed to Chantal, he was arrested while trying to evade the police while driving a stolen vehicle and was sentenced to 8 months in prison. Although Charles' imprisonment, Chantal never left him. She waited for him while he was serving his sentence. Therefore, as soon as Charles was released, he immediately married Chantal. In 1970, with Felix's help and due to his birth in a French colony, Charles obtained French citizenship. That same year, he left France quietly with Chantal, who was pregnant, heading to India because the French police were investigating his crimes. At that time, they traveled through Eastern Europe with fake documents and even robbed tourists they met along the way. After arriving in Mumbai, India, Charles, in order to satisfy his increasingly severe gambling addiction, continued his criminal career, engaging in car theft, smuggling, and robbery. It was during this time that he met Marie, a young backpacker from Canada. Influenced by Charles' sweet talk and carefully crafted facade, she became his most loyal follower. Meanwhile, Ajay, a young Indian man and a criminal, also became his accomplice. Notably, both Marie and Ajay would later become Charles' accomplices in murders. In 1971, Charles carried out a jewelry robbery at the Ashok Hotel in Delhi, India, which also attracted the attention of the police. Coincidentally, a criminal who had received help from the police joined Charles' criminal gang. Having seen that Charles and his associates were carrying firearms, he fearfully approached the police officer who had helped him, named Zende, and revealed Charles' plan to carry out a robbery near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Based on the information provided by this criminal, Zende set up a stackout near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Ultimately, Zende and his team successfully arrested Charles and his 5 criminal accomplices, confiscating the rifle and revolver used for the robbery. Charles was an extremely cunning individual. During his imprisonment, he feigned appendicitis and was admitted to the hospital. Later, he took advantage of the power outages caused by the India-Pakistan War to stealthily escape from the hospital's drainpipe, right under the noses of the guards. He was soon recaptured by the police. With no other choice, Charles borrowed money from his stepfather to pay the bail. Several days later, he fled to Kabul, Afghanistan with Chantal. In there, Charles and Chantal robbed Western tourists along the hippie trail. Not long after, he was arrested by the Afghan police for offenses such as car theft, illegal border crossing, and refusal to pay hotel bills. Once again, he resorted to his old tricks, faking illness and drugging the guards at the hospital to successfully escape from prison. However, this time, seeing her husband's actions, although Chantal still loved him, she had grown tired of the life of constant criminality and flight, so she took their daughter back to France and said never to see Charles again. Over the next 2 years, Charles was constantly on the run from the police. Knowing the weaknesses of human nature, sometimes he would disguise himself as a gemstone salesman, and at other times he would pose as a drug dealer, using carefully woven lies to deceive Western tourists, befriend them, and extract money from them as well as steal their passports. After arriving in Istanbul, Charles met his half-brother, Andrei. Soon they became criminal accomplices and committed a series of crimes in Turkey and Greece. Eventually they were arrested in Athens, Greece. Charles managed to escape, but Andrei was handed over to the Turkish police and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1975, Charles fled to Thailand. It was here that he and Ajay committed their first known murder. Later on, the police said that most of the people killed by Charles were actually part of his gang and had committed crimes. Charles said that most of his murders were accidental, due to overdoses of temazepam and heroin. To counter Charles' argument, the police insisted that the real reason for the murders was that the victims had threatened to expose Charles' criminal activities. Those days were the heyday of the hippie trail. A large number of backpackers and hippies traveled along the hippie trail to India, Nepal, and Thailand. It is well known the cultures and languages of Europe and Asia are completely different. For Western backpackers and hippies, arriving in Asia was like entering a completely different world, where tension and anxiety were extremely common. Charles took advantage of this. Speaking the same language, he fabricated false names and identities for himself, offering these tourists language assistance and places to stay, thereby gaining their trust. Charles' first victim was a young woman named Teresa Knowlton. She was from Seattle, United States. When her body was found, she was lying in a pool on the Gulf of Thailand, wearing a floral bikini. Initially, it was thought to be a swimming accident. However, an autopsy and forensic evidence several months later proved that her drowning was actually a murder. Next, a young Sephardic Jew named Vitaly Hakim became Charles' next victim. His body was found on the way to the resort in Pattaya, which was where Charles and his criminal gang were hiding. Later, a 29-year-old Dutch student, Henk Bintanja, and his 25-year-old fiancée, Cornelia Hemker, met Charles in Hong Kong and were invited by him to Thailand. Like the other victims, they were poisoned by Charles, affecting their health. Naturally, Charles used the excuse of taking care of their recovery to keep them in Thailand. As Hank and Cornelia gradually recovered, Vitali's French girlfriend, Charmaine Carew, came to visit Charles, intending to find the missing Vitali. Charles knew that if she discovered the truth, his crimes would be exposed. So he and Ajay quickly drove Hank and Cornelia out. Shortly after they were found, they had been strangled and burned. Charmaine was also found drowned, wearing a swimsuit style identical to Therese's. At that time, investigators did not connect Therese's and Charmaine's deaths. Later, when these cases were linked to Charles, he earned the nickname Bikini Killer. December 18, 1975, the very day that Hank and Cornelia were found, Charles and Marie brazenly used the couple's passports to enter Nepal. A few days later, on December 21st to 22nd, in Nepal, Charles brutally murdered 26-year-old Canadian Laurent and 29-year-old American Connie. Later, Charles and Marie used Laurent and Connie's passports to return to Thailand. However, upon returning to Thailand, Charles unexpectedly learned that 3 French tourists he had deceived had discovered the victim's identity documents and suspected him of multiple murders, reporting the case to the police and fleeing back to Paris. Charles' next destination was reportedly Varanasi or Kolkata. There, he committed another murder in order to obtain the passport of Israeli scholar Avoni Jacob. And then, with Marie and Ajay, he traveled using the victims' passports, first to Singapore and back to India. In March 1976, despite knowing that the Thai police were investigating him, Charles returned to Bangkok once again. This time, he and Marie, along with Ajay, were interrogated by the police in connection with the murders, but were released. Meanwhile, Dutch diplomat Herman Nippenberg and his wife Angela Kane were working hard to investigate the murders of Hank and Cornelia. Herman had some knowledge of Charles and may have even seen him, though he was unaware of Charles' true identity. Later, with the help of Charles' neighbors Nadine and Remy Girard, he filed a lawsuit against Charles. However, it was only a month after Charles had left Thailand that Herman obtained police permission to search Charles' apartment, where he found concrete evidence of Charles' crimes, including the victims' documents and passports, as well as poison and syringes. Charles and Marie, along with Ajay, next headed to Malaysia. There, Ajay was seen handing over gems to Charles, which was the last time he was spotted. It is said that before Charles left Malaysia, he killed Ajay to eliminate any potential threats and continued to pose as a gem dealer with Marie. Later, there were claims that Ajay was seen in West Germany, but this assertion was never verified. In May 1976, Interpol issued an international arrest warrant for Charles, charging him with 4 murders in Thailand. However, Charles did not halt his activities. Instead, he formed a new criminal gang. The new members were 2 Western women living in Mumbai, Barbara Smith and Mary Either. His next victim was a Frenchman named Solomon, who was poisoned by Charles during a robbery. Charles had initially intended only to incapacitate Solomon and take his passport, but he accidentally killed him. In July 1976, in New Delhi, he and his 3 female accomplices deceived a group of French graduate students, convincing them to accept them as guides. During this time, Charles drugged the students, claiming the substances were anti-dysentery medication. However, the drugs took effect faster than Charles had anticipated. Before reaching their destination, some of the students began to lose consciousness. 3 of the students realized what Charles had done, quickly subdued him, and contacted the police. Later, Charles' accomplices Barbara and Either confessed during the interrogation. Charles was charged with the murder of Solomon, and all 4 were sent to Tihar jail in New Delhi. While in Tihar jail in New Delhi, Barbara and Either experienced extreme despair in the 2 years leading up to their trial, both attempting to end their lives in prison. However, Charles seemed to be in a completely different world. He entered the prison with valuable gems and used his extensive experience in bribery and kidnapping. He lived an extremely comfortable life in prison, with access to a television and gourmet food, and befriended both the guards and other inmates. Additionally, he turned the trial into a spectacle, casually hiring and firing lawyers, and even enlisted the help of his paroled brother Andre. Ultimately, Charles was sentenced to only 12 years in prison after staging a hunger strike. Meanwhile, Marie was convicted of drugging the French students. Later, due to her ovarian cancer, she was deported back to Canada. According to reports, even before her death, Marie still tried to defend Charles. In his imprisonment, Charles also gave interviews to Western writers and journalists, freely discussing his murders with them. However, later on, he denied his previous statements, pretending that his actions were a form of revenge against Western imperialism in Asia. In March 1986, during the 10th year of his imprisonment and just before his sentence was about to end, Charles realized that he was about to be extradited to Thailand for trial and would likely face the death penalty. So, he threw a grand party for his guards and fellow inmates, drugged them with sleeping pills during the event, and took the opportunity to walk out of the prison. In order to capture Charles, the Indian police turned to Zende, who had arrested him over a decade earlier. Receiving the order, Zende assembled a team and began tracking Charles' whereabouts. Their investigation went extremely smoothly, quickly yielding 2 key leads. The first was from a hotel owner in Mumbai who noticed that a man's license plate did not match the official records. The second was from a telephone exchange in Goa, which showed that a man frequently visited a restaurant and made international calls. Zende, posing as a tourist, spent several days observing the restaurant. On the evening of April 6, 1986, Zende saw Charles, wearing a hat, enter the restaurant gracefully. And then, he and his team approached Charles and said, "Hello, Charles. How are you?" Hearing this, Charles attempted to draw his weapon but was swiftly arrested by Zende's team. Later, due to his prison escape, Charles was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. However, this was precisely what Charles had anticipated. On February 17, 1997, at the age of 52, Charles walked out of prison. By this time, most of his arrest warrants and evidence had become invalid, and even the witnesses had long since disappeared. Since no country could extradite Charles, the Indian police could only watch as he returned to France. Living in the suburbs of Paris, Charles led an extremely comfortable life. He earned substantial fees from interviews and photo shoots, and even the rights to a movie based on his life were sold for over $15 million. However, Charles seemed to have been intoxicated by the attention he received. In 2003, he made an inexplicable decision to return to Nepal, one of the few countries where he could be arrested. On September 1, 2003, a reporter from the Himalayan Times chanced upon Charles in a casino in Kathmandu. In order to gain attention, the reporter followed Charles for 2 weeks and wrote a news article with photographs. After seeing the report, the Nepalese police quickly took action, raided the casino, and arrested Charles while he was gambling. In 2004, Charles was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1975 murder of Connie. On September 18, 2014, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the 1975 murder of Laurent. On December 23, 2022, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered Charles' release from prison on humanitarian grounds due to his advanced age and deteriorating health. This day, at the age of 81, Charles still lives in France, though his condition is frail. No one knows exactly how many people Charles killed. He has made various confessions and admitted to 12 murders. However, given his frequent lies and tendency to retract his statements, it is clear that 12 is likely not the true number. Although the exact number of his victims and his motives for killing remain uncertain, one thing is certain: Charles shows no remorse for his crimes. Connecticut is one of the top financial centers in the United States, and its per capita income is also at the forefront of the world. 5 years ago, the virus broke out in the world. Connecticut was no exception. Like other cities, it put a stay-at-home order in place. People were stuck at home and couldn't go out, and loads of businesses in catering and retail had to close. But actually, this was not the first time Connecticut had been through something like this. 68 years ago, the people there felt a kind of fear that felt like it was stopping them from breathing. In those days, people would lock their doors really tight and would not go outside, and after sunset, all kinds of shops would close doors. It was not because of a virus, it was because of 2 real men wandering the streets, Joseph Taborski and Arthur Cullen, who committed a series of brutal robberies and murders. In addition, there's so much drama in the story of Joseph and Arthur. Joseph is the only criminal in Connecticut's history who's been sentenced to death twice for different crimes. Arthur never knew he had the right to remain silent or the right to legal counsel, and his confession was made after being put through the ringer for days and the cops threatening him. Joseph was born in Hartford on the 23rd of March 1924. He was the eldest in his family, with a younger brother and 2 sisters. His mother was a proper religious woman, spent all her time running the house and keeping the family going. His father was a salesman who worked door to door, had a mental disability, and was often away from home. As the eldest son, Joseph didn't get the attention from his mother that he should have, and he also lacked the fatherly love and guidance he needed. When Joseph was 7 years old, he committed his first crime, stealing a bike, and in the following months, he continued to commit several counts of burglary and shoplifting. Later on, his mother remembered that Joseph had nicked a bike out of resentment after his own bike had been stolen. She was a housewife who had to look after several kids and a husband with mental disabilities. She didn't have much time to correct his psychology and behavior. So she thought that Joseph's bike theft was just a way of dealing with his emotional issues. However, several months later, Joseph pinched another bike, and at that time, he got sent down to a juvenile detention center for 9 months. Not long after, Joseph was sentenced to an extra 3 to 5 years in prison for escaping. The prison walls didn't stop him wanting to be free, but they did lock him up for most of his youth. Every time he got out of prison, he tried to get back into a normal life, working as a laborer and a truck driver. But it didn't take long before he was back in the prison for theft. Back in 1948, Joseph, aged 24, started working at a freight transportation facility, where he first met his partner in crime, Arthur. Arthur was the same age, but he was as clueless as a 9-year-old, couldn't read or tell time. And later, a police officer said that Arthur's learning disability meant he was very easily influenced. For instance, on August 21, 1944, Arthur was involved in the burglary and robbery of 2 service stations in Hartford with 2 other criminals. And in the very next day, he was involved in another robbery. As a result, Joseph, who was ambitious and had bad intentions, saw Arthur, who was intellectually limited, as the easiest person to manipulate. On March 23, 1950, Joseph, aged 26, was at a crossroads in his life, and he chose a path that would take him down a one-way street. That day, he and his brother Albert had planned to rob Louis's liquor store in West Hartford. Louis was just an ordinary businessman who worked hard every day to make a living, yet he became a victim of this terrible crime. During the robbery, Joseph and Albert accidentally shot Louis in the face. Louis was really badly hurt. Although he made it to hospital, he was close to dying. But he was still managed to give the police a description of the gunman. He said, light hair, baby face, medium height, as he was breathing his last. In reality, this description didn't match the physical characteristics of Joseph and Albert, especially Joseph, who was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, had black hair, and a prominent chin. Because of the wrong description of the suspect, the murder case was still unsolved for a whole year. It was not until Albert, unable to bear the torment at his conscience, voluntarily surrendered to the police and admitted that he and his brother killed Louis. After the jury talked it over for 9 hours, they decided Joseph should be sentenced to death for first-degree murder on June 7, 1951, and Albert was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. While he was waiting to be executed, Joseph showed that he was a good lying, always saying that he was innocent. Meanwhile, Albert's mental state completely collapsed, and he was transferred to the prison's mental health department and then to Norwich State Hospital. As the witness who sent Joseph to death row, Albert's mental breakdown brought the case back into the public spotlight. Then, Joseph and his defense attorneys seized this opportunity, bribing some newspapers to label the Louis murder case as the Cain and Abel case. They claimed that out of jealousy and anger, Albert wanted to kill Joseph, so he deliberately confessed to send Joseph to death row. Albert's mental health issues and public opinion put pressure on the local court, who then said that the evidence used to convict Joseph and sentence him to death and keep him in prison was not enough. Joseph was let out of prison on the 6th of October 1955. Before he was let out of death row, Joseph did an interview in prison saying, "How can such great injustice be done to the innocent? If you could only realize the feeling of helplessness I had, it hurts me especially to see my mother suffer." Less than a year after he got out of prison, Joseph moved from Hartford to Brooklyn, New York, and married a woman who had often written to him while he was on death row. But his marriage and work were a bit rocky, which left Joseph feeling a bit lost. September 1956, Joseph got back in touch with Arthur and decided to team up with him for crimes. They started out committing burglaries and shop robberies in Hartford and the Rocky Mountains of Connecticut, but gradually moved on to murders. In early December, they robbed a hotel, but luckily the staff got away without any harm. Several days later, they hit a liquor store in Hartford. Jack, the owner of this liquor store, was constantly being beaten by Joseph and Arthur with a handgun. 7 days later, the Rocky Mountains became the stage for their evil deeds. They robbed a local store of at least $100, and the store owner was also beaten with a handgun. 4 days later, on December 15, 1956, Nicola, a 67-year-old tailor, was working in his shop when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the face. Luckily, the bullet only went into his neck and didn't kill him. An hour after Nicola was almost murdered, Joseph and Arthur drove to a petrol station in New Britain. Their minds were set on two things: robbing the place and killing anyone who got in their way. The gas station owner was Edward, a hard-working 30-year-old veteran. At the time, Edward was working on a car. So while they were filling up the tank, Joseph said he had to use the toilet and told Edward that Arthur would pay for the petrol. But after paying, Arthur went up to Edward and pulled out a Russian-style revolver. He threatened Edward, saying, "Go into the boiler room, or I will kill you." In that tiny space, Arthur shot Edward and stole his wallet. Meanwhile, Joseph took the money from the cash register. At this unfortunate moment, Daniel, also 30 years old and with his infant daughter in the car, pulled up to the gas station and parked at the entrance. Joseph and Arthur had just finished robbing the place and were planning to wait for Daniel to leave, but he didn't. So they decided to take action. They slowly approached Daniel's car, with Arthur pretending to check the vehicle to distract Daniel. Then, out of the blue, Joseph got closer, pointed a gun at Daniel and said he had to get out of the car, hand over his wallet and go to the restroom at the gas station, and there, Joseph shot Daniel in the head without hesitation. After that, Joseph and Arthur quickly left the crime scene. They drove to Arthur's house, split the stolen money evenly, and threw the bloodied revolver in a nearby shallow pond. Several hours later, Joseph went back to his home in Brooklyn, New York, as if nothing had happened. The next day, Edward and Daniel were found. Daniel's daughter was found safe in the car, but she'd fallen asleep from being hungry and tired. Both victims had been in the United States Armed Forces. So the double murder sent shockwaves through the whole state of Connecticut. The governor offered a reward of $3,000 for info that would lead to the arrest and conviction of the murderers, and the mayor of New Britain added another $2,000. The state police also set up a special task force to handle the case, which became known as the Mad Dog Killings. Just 6 days later, on December 21st, 1956, the pair went after a grocery store in Coventry. The store was owned by 64-year-old Vinton and his wife, and at the time their granddaughter, 3-year-old Lori, was also in the store. What was meant to be a cozy family moment was ruined by Joseph and Arthur barging in. They beat Vinton and his wife with a gun and stole $100. During the ordeal, Joseph told Arthur to kill Lori, but he didn't. Instead, he took her to a corner of the grocery store, told her to stay quiet, and fired a few shots into the floor to make it look like she was dead, to trick Joseph. 5 days later, on the evening of December 26th, a liquor store became their target. The 65-year-old owner, Cullen, was busy in the store when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the head. They then emptied the cash register, searched Cullen's pockets, and took all his money. Several minutes later, a customer went into Cullen's liquor store and found his body lying behind the counter. There were no witnesses, and the neighbors didn't see or hear anything strange, but the police, who were pretty good at their jobs, figured out straight away that Cohn's murder was linked to the killings of Edward and Daniel on December 15th. The method was always the same. They'd empty the cash registers and wallets of their victims, then shoot them in the head before getting away and leaving no evidence. January 5, 1957, Joseph and Arthur went on another crime spree, this time targeting a shoe store in North Haven, Connecticut. The owner was Frank, a 44-year-old businessman. At the time, the two crooks burst into the shoe store and forced Frank into a back room, where Arthur grabbed a gun and smashed it violently against Frank's head until he fell into a state of apparent death. But Joseph and Arthur's crimes weren't over yet, as there were still two customers in the store, 48-year-old Bernard and his wife Ruth. Since the couple had witnessed the entire assault on Frank, Bernard and Ruth would become key witnesses that could send Joseph and Arthur to prison if they were not silenced. So, Joseph and Arthur decided to eliminate them. They robbed the couple of their wallets, forced them to kneel on the ground, and shot them in the back of the head with a handgun, ending their lives. After the murder of Bernard and Ruth, the Connecticut police set up a special headquarters in North Haven dedicated to investigating the case. Liquor store operators also began arming themselves and bringing dogs to work in an attempt to fend off the attackers. What's more, Frank, who had been knocked into a state of apparent death, did not die. He was a lucky man. He survived. Frank gave the police a good description of the attacker's appearance when he was in the hospital ward. He remembered that one of the attackers had asked to see shoes in a size 12. And later, while reviewing prison records, police noticed that Joseph wore shoes of the same size. They then showed Frank some photos of Joseph and Arthur, and in the end, Frank was pretty sure that Arthur was one of the attackers. Around 9 o'clock on the evening of January 26th, Joseph and Arthur struck again, this time targeting Rosenthal's drugstore. At the time, 69-year-old John was alone on the first floor of the drugstore, while his son, Henry, was working in the basement. However, Joseph burst into the drugstore and fired 2 shots into John's chest, ending his life. Hearing the gunshots, Henry ran out from the basement and saw Joseph standing next to the cash register, looting the money. In a state of anger and fear, he threw a medicine bottle at Joseph, who fired back at Henry. Fortunately, the bullet only hit the wall. Joseph then fled outside, jumped into a dark-colored Studebaker, and left the scene. Later, Henry gave the officers a description of the attacker. He said the man was tall, between 30 and 40 years old, had black hair, and was wearing a coat. His description matched the clues Frank had given. In the end, police confirmed that Joseph and Arthur were behind the series of crimes. On February 23, 1957, they arrested Joseph and Arthur, charging them with disorderly conduct while awaiting the results of a full investigation into the murder spree. In order to prevent the two from colluding, police deliberately kept them in separate custody. Joseph was detained in the Hartford County Jail, while Arthur was held in the Hartford Police Barracks. 4 days later, after a lot of questioning and some force, Arthur admitted to being involved in 8 robberies and 6 murders, and showed the officers the weapon they'd used to kill Edward and Daniel. When Arthur first came clean, he said that Joseph had fired all the fatal shots, while he himself had only been involved in beating several victims with a handgun and driving their getaway car. Joseph initially insisted he wasn't involved in the crimes, but on March 1st, the police used a clever strategy. They encouraged Joseph's mother to bring a tape recorder and have a chat with Joseph to try and get him to confess. In the end, after his mother had a good nudge, Joseph came clean about all the murders, including the 1950 killing of Louis. Later on, even more shocking was that Joseph and Arthur committed a series of robberies and murders. But according to the police, despite killing several people and committing crimes that impacted the entire state of Connecticut, the loot they obtained amounted to less than $400. In May 1957, Joseph and Arthur stood trial together. The trial focused mostly on the murders of Edward and Daniel. Arthur's attorney tried to use Arthur's mental disability to persuade the jury not to impose the death penalty. He made a heartfelt plea in court saying, "I can't believe that any American jury would sentence Arthur, who has intellectual disabilities, to death." Joseph's attorney said that Joseph had spent 4 years on death row, so his murder spree was partly an act of revenge. He also mentioned something Joseph told the prison psychiatrist: "When I kill someone, they don't think it's wrong that they wanted to kill me. During the trial, Joseph not only laughed at the evidence against him, he also made threatening gestures at others in the courtroom. This made the jury and spectators even angrier, and it also put his attorneys in a bit of a pickle. After weeks of heated deliberation and presentation of evidence, the jury finally ruled on June 27th that Joseph and Arthur were guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced them to death. The local newspaper also published an editorial in support of the death penalty for the two defendants, stating, "If the death penalty is justified, then it is justified for these two." While waiting to be executed, Joseph attempted suicide twice, but failed both times. Later, he wrote a letter stating that executing a criminal would be kinder than imprisoning them for years. He said he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison, and he acted on this by giving up all chances to appeal. On the evening of May 17, 1960, Joseph was executed by electric chair, marking the last time the electric chair was used in Connecticut. Meanwhile, Arthur continued fighting his death sentence. In the end, he accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, sparing him the death penalty and sentencing him to life in prison. He died in prison on December 22, 1970, of natural causes. In reality, before the Mad Dog killings, the Connecticut governor and local newspapers had been calling for the abolition of the death penalty. But after the killings, the governor's stance shifted drastically. He stated he now supported the death penalty for Joseph and Arthur. Local newspapers also reversed their position, arguing that while the death penalty is neither a deterrent nor a perfect punishment, it is necessary in some cases, much like putting out a fire or putting down a mad dog. When Louis was murdered, his wife moved her family out of Connecticut. When Joseph was arrested, she repeatedly criticized those calling for the abolition of the death penalty, asking, "How does it feel knowing that you and others like you helped a man commit more murders when you could have stopped him after the first one?" December 12, 1947. Thomas Daly, the 40-year-old leader of one small street gang in Chicago, went to John Cusa's garage with two of his subordinates, James Morelli and Lowell Fentress. The 33-year-old John, who was a garage operator, had turned an informant for the police. 3 months earlier, he was the one who reported the $800 robbery carried out by Thomas and Fentress. Despite being tried for the crime, both Thomas and Fentress were let off. For Thomas, the leader of one street gang in Chicago, however small it might be, betrayal was an action he would never stand. He was enraged by John's report to the authorities and began to contemplate revenge. However, no one knew that this retaliation would escalate into a bloody mass murder. On the evening of December 12, 1947, Thomas pulled into John's garage with James and Fentress. Waiting inside, in addition to John himself, were his friends and colleagues, Peder, Schmeichel, Frank, and John's brother Nick. Seeing that there were a large number of people on the other side, James quickly drew his pistol, pointing the muzzle at the 4 people other than John to restrict their movements. Meanwhile, Thomas and Fentress grabbed John and started to beat him. During the beating, John's resistance completely enraged Thomas. Suddenly, to everyone's horror, he directly drew his gun and shot John, ending his life. Everyone knows a brawl and a murder are two very different things. After John fell to the ground, Thomas, James, and Fentress shared a look. They knew that if John had only been injured, the other 4 witnesses would have been a manageable problem. But with John dead, these 4 men had witnessed a killing. One tacit understanding passed between them. Peder, Schmeichel, Frank, and Nick all have to die. First, they herded the 4 witnesses into their car and then embarked on a frantic 8-hour drive through the Chicago suburbs. At the time, an eerie silence reigned inside the car, punctuated only by the hum of tires on asphalt and occasional muffled whimpers. At random intervals during those long 8 hours, they would select one of the witnesses, execute them with a gunshot, and discard the body from the moving car. In the end, all 4 witnesses had been shot, and only the perpetrators remained in the car. Following the murders, Thomas and his 2 subordinates, attempted to cover up their crimes by disposing of the murder weapons in a nearby ditch. Later, Fentress drove James and Thomas to James's apartment before returning home himself. What they did not know, however, was that only Theodore and Schmeichel had died from their gunshot wounds. Frank and Nick had miraculously survived and provided the police with full account of the events. Several hours later, several police cars with flashing lights pulled up outside Fentress's apartment. Seeing the police surrounding his apartment, Fentress realized that he had nowhere to run. He surrendered, putting his hands up and confessing everything he knew to the police, including the fact that James and Thomas were hiding in James' apartment. He hoped this would increase his chances of survival. When the police arrived at James' apartment, he had already fled the room, leaving only Thomas inside. At the moment, Thomas tried to escape through the window, but the police decisively fired to stop him. In the end, Thomas fell in a pool of blood, dying from the gunshot, just like the victims he had murdered. The next day, which was December 14th, the day after the murders, after a night of internal struggle, James chose to surrender. Facing the police, he said firmly, "I would rather sit in a jail cell than lie on a slab in the morgue." Following their arrest, both James and Fentress wanted to shift the blame onto Thomas, accusing him of being the mastermind. James insisted that the only shot he fired was accidental, while Fentress stated that Thomas had ordered him to finish off Nick and Frank after injuring them, though he only fired at the ground. The two criminals' testimonies were filled with mutual shirking of responsibility and accusations, but only one of them is telling the truth. On December 15th, the police announced the results of their investigation, determining that James and Fentress, like Thomas, were criminally responsible for the murders. They stated that they planned to sentence each of them to death. The trial officially began in 1948. Although the state government sought the death penalty for James and Fentress, the jury ultimately decided to sentence them to 199 years imprisonment after a brief deliberation. During sentencing, the judge told James, "If anyone deserves to be executed, as they say on the streets, it is this young man." In mid-January 1949, James and Fentress appeared in court again, this time charged with the murder of Schmeichel. The two criminals still wanted to shift all blame onto their deceased accomplice, Thomas. James' attorney, Charles, argued that James and Fentress were victims of their upbringing, shaped by the deprived areas and broken families in which they had grown up. The prosecution, however, he urged the jury that, while sympathy for the defendants was understandable, it should not lead to compromise in the face of such a brutal crime. Following 9 hours of deliberation, the jury found the two men guilty of murdering Schmeichel. Fentress was sentenced to an additional 199 years in prison, to be served consecutively with his previous sentence. James, however, was sentenced to death, with his execution scheduled for March 19, 1949. They were also charged with the murder of Theodore, but as the previous sentences were severe enough and further trials would not have been helpful, this case did not proceed to trial. Later, Charles appealed to the Supreme Court of Illinois, challenging both James's conviction and his death sentence. Consequently, the local judge suspended the execution and postponed it from March 19th to May 14th. On May 12th, just 2 days before James was due to be executed, the local judge granted a further delay, pushing the execution date to August 12th, to allow time for a hearing with the Illinois Pardons and Parole Board in July. On July 12th, at the clemency hearing, Charles argued for a retrial in an attempt to reduce James' death sentence to life imprisonment. He claimed that local newspapers had often depicted James as a mad dog, and that this negative coverage had led to jury bias and a wrongful verdict. To support his argument, Charles also submitted a clemency petition signed by 1,600 residents of James' community. However, the local prosecutor then urged the board not to interfere with the verdict. He emphasized that Schmeichel had been murdered in a gangland-style attack and that this was one of the most brutal murders in Chicago's history. Ultimately, the Illinois Pardons and Parole Board denied James's request for leniency and confirmed his execution date as November 25, 1949. Just 30 hours before James was to be executed, two of his friends managed to smuggle a hacksaw and firearms into the prison in a futile attempt to help him break out. Frantically seeking any means to stall his fate, James made a contrite gesture, He offered to donate his corneas to a blind person, asking only for lifetime financial security for his soon-to-be widowed wife and their children. According to accounts, it was during this period, while awaiting execution, that James held his infant daughter for the first and only time. Gazing upon his wife and child then, he may have regretted his decision to join the gang and abandon his family. His plan also could have bought him an additional 24 hours, as doctors would have required time to prepare for the corneal transplant surgery. However, the Attorney General of Illinois rejected his appeal. At midnight on November 26th, James was executed in the electric chair at Cook County Jail. He remained silent in the execution chamber. His final words spoken before entering were, "I have nothing to say." Having served 27 years, Fentress was granted parole and freed in 1974. Upon release, he made a profound choice. Instead of evading his past, he would use it as a foundation for the future. He channeled his experience into creating a foundation aimed at assisting former prisoners with societal reintegration. When he and another former inmate shared their journeys in a 1979 interview, Fentress's life story became a powerful testament to redemption and a genuine beacon for countless others hoping to reform their lives. On October 28, 1996, Fentress passed away in Indiana. The exact reason why he was not sentenced to death is unknown. The jury never explained. Perhaps it was because he cooperated with the police by revealing where Thomas and James were hiding. Perhaps it was because he did not actually kill the victims. Or maybe the jury saw how remorseful he was and how much he wanted a better future. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States experienced rapid industrialization and urbanization. This economic boom created the American dream, attracting countless immigrants seeking better jobs and pay. San Francisco was a key entry point for Asian immigrants, many of whom were hired by the Central Pacific Railroad Company to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked the east and west coasts. Meanwhile, the western frontier held vast expanses of undeveloped land. As a crucial transport hub in the Midwest with well-developed rail and water networks, Chicago became one of the primary destinations for European immigrants. In the early 20th century, the city absorbed approximately 250,000 immigrants, including Poles, Italians, Irish, and Jews. However, despite the abundance of job opportunities in Chicago, immigrants often faced precarious living conditions. They were confined to overcrowded slums and endured harsh work environments, low wages, and a lack of social support. And this challenging environment gave rise to numerous gangs. Groups such as the Mafia, Irish gangs, the Latin Kings emerged, frequently resorting to violence and criminal activities to compete for territory and resources. Following the implementation of Prohibition in 1920, the legal sale of alcohol was completely banned. These gangs made huge profits from smuggling alcohol and running speakeasies. They grew rapidly, recruiting immigrants to commit a wide range of crimes related to smuggling and gambling. After the outbreak of the Great Depression, when the U.S. economy fell into a long-term recession and society was in turmoil, these gangs committed countless violent crimes, including theft, extortion, gambling, and murder. Just as Charles said, both James and Fentress grew up in a similar environment. They were products of this chaos, raised in dilapidated slums with no access to good jobs. Gangs could quickly recruit members because they offered these inexperienced, resourceless young people money, protection, and a sense of belonging. Many young people like James were influenced by gangs and committed crimes such as smuggling, gambling, extortion, and ultimately ruining their own lives. Over a criminal career spanning 20 to 40 years, Charles Ray Hatcher continuously carried out crimes including kidnapping, rape, and murder. Labels like sadist, paranoid schizophrenic are not enough to describe Hatcher's evil nature. Words cannot accurately describe what this type of person truly is. Although he is of the human race, his behavior is more like a beast. Hatcher's criminal story is not just a case about a serial killer. It also profoundly reveals many loopholes in the judicial system and parole boards in assessing, supervising, and managing high-risk offenders. In the end, his suicide was a lie. it was another murder case. On July 16, 1929, Hatcher was born in Mound City, Missouri. His parents had 4 children, with Hatcher being the youngest. His father, Jesse, was a notorious criminal with a criminal record of smuggling and an alcoholic, who often abused Hatcher and his siblings. In the spring of 1936, 6-year-old Hatcher and his brothers were playing in their neighborhood when they came across some copper wire. His 7-year-old brother, Alan, had the idea to use it to fly a kite. He picked up the wire and attached it to the kite. However, with no adult around to warn them of the danger, the children were completely unaware that copper wire could conduct electricity. While the boys ran carelessly along the road, Alan accidentally let the wire touch a high-voltage power line. Just in few seconds, his skin turned charred, his heart stopped, and his breathing ceased. His body grew rigid before collapsing to the ground, motionless. After the accident, Hatcher's parents had a fierce argument. His personality also became weak, and he was filled with fear and helplessness. When he entered school, he was always bullied by his peers. Although the teasing and bullying made him feel deeply helpless, inheriting his father's violent genes, he did not choose silence but responded in a wrong way by bullying weaker classmates, and this vicious cycle continued into his adulthood. Several years later, Hatcher's father left home and divorced his mother. During this time, his mother remarried several times. In 1945, Hatcher and his mother, along with her third husband, moved to St. Joseph, which was 34 miles away from Mound City. 2 years later, young Hatcher began working at the Iowa-Missouri Walnut Company. However, this job did not bring about any positive changes in his life. Instead, he made an impulsive decision. He stole a logging truck and attempted to flee St. Joseph. Without a plan, Hatcher was quickly apprehended. However, since he was not yet 18 years old, the court only sentenced him to 2 years of probation. This was the first time in Hatcher's life that he faced legal consequences for a crime, but unfortunately, it was not the last one. Just 1 year later, in 1948, Hatcher made the same mistake again. He stole a Buick in St. Joseph. This time, without the protection of the juvenile justice system, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, beginning his incarceration at the Missouri State Penitentiary. On June 8, 1949, Hatcher was released from prison early. However, just a few months later, he was arrested again for passing a counterfeit $10 check at a gas station in Maryville. This time, he was sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison. On March 18, 1951, Hatcher attempted to escape from prison and committed a burglary, but his plan failed and he was arrested once more, receiving another 2-year sentence. On July 14, 1954, Hatcher finally completed his additional sentence and walked out of the prison gates again. However, prison life did not lead him to reform. Shortly thereafter, he stole a Ford in Orick and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. While awaiting sentencing, he tried to escape from the Ray County Jail in Richmond, but his escape plan failed again, and then, in addition to the 4-year sentence, he was given an extra 2 years in prison. On March 18, 1959, Hatcher experienced his 6th imprisonment and was finally released again. This time, his crimes escalated to assault and kidnapping. On June 26th, he attempted to kidnap a 16-year-old paperboy named Stephen. He threatened Stephen with a butcher knife. Fortunately, Stephen managed to escape and report the incident to the police. Several hours later, Hatcher was arrested when the police were investigating a stolen vehicle. This time, Hatcher was sentenced to 5 years in prison under the Habitual Offender Act, with charges of attempted kidnapping and auto theft. While waiting to be transferred to prison, Hatcher once again attempted to escape. However, fate seemed to be against him, and his plan failed once more. Upon entering the Missouri State Penitentiary, he claimed to be the most notorious criminal in northwest Missouri since Jesse James. Jesse James was Hatcher's father. No one knows if Jesse was a source of enduring pain or secret pride to Hatcher. But one thing is certain. He was the primary reason Hatcher embarked on a life of crime. On July 2, 1961, a shocking murder occurred in the Missouri State Penitentiary. A 26-year-old inmate named Jerry Tharrington was found raped and stabbed to death on the floor of the prison kitchen loading dock. First, Hatcher was one of the kitchen workers in the prison. Second, at the time of the murder, Hatcher was the only kitchen worker missing, which made him the prime suspect, and he was almost considered to be involved in the murder. So, the prison staff placed Hatcher in solitary confinement. During his time in solitary confinement, he wrote a note claiming that he needed psychiatric treatment. The prison psychologist did not believe his story and thought it was just a trick he was using to get out of prison early. Despite strong suspicion against him, Hatcher could not be convicted in court due to insufficient evidence. Therefore, he was sent back to the general prison population, and his sentence was reduced to 3/4 of the original time. On August 24, 1963, Hatcher was released from prison again. 6 years later, on August 27, 1969, 12-year-old William disappeared after school. His family and friends searched frantically, but in the end, all they found was tragedy. Hatcher later admitted that he lured William to go with him, took him to a creek, and then brutally strangled him to death. Just 2 days later, 6-year-old Gilbert vanished in San Francisco. According to the little girl he had been playing with, Gilbert followed a man who offered him ice cream. Fortunately, he was discovered by a man walking his dog, who found him being beaten and sexually assaulted. The police quickly arrived on the scene and arrested the attacker. He identified himself as Albert Price, but his identification card bore the name Peder. Later, it was confirmed by the FBI that both Price and Peder were aliases used by Hatcher. At that time, Hatcher was charged with assault, attempted sodomy, and kidnapping. He was ordered to undergo a competency evaluation to determine whether he was fit to stand trial. However, during the initial evaluation, Hatcher was unusually silent, so the evaluators decided to conduct a comprehensive psychological assessment. During the assessment, Hatcher claimed to hear voices and reported having delusions and suicidal attempts. So, the police and the court were unable to proceed with the trial. Over the next 2 years, Hatcher shuttled back and forth between the court and the hospital. During this period, a psychiatrist diagnosed him with a passive-aggressive personality, along with mental disorders of sexual inversion and pedophilia. Hospital staff suspected that Hatcher was fabricating or exaggerating his symptoms of mental illness. So, in January 1971, Hatcher was examined by 2 psychiatrists. The first one declared him mentally deranged and recommended intensive treatment in a secure hospital, while the second one declared him unfit to stand trial and sent him back to the hospital. On May 24, 1971, Hatcher's trial began. Standing in the courtroom, he presented the evaluations from the 2 psychiatrists, claiming that he was mentally deranged and unable to plead guilty. To ensure the accuracy of the evaluations, Hatcher was sent to another hospital for further assessments, where he was once again determined to be unfit to stand trial. On June 2nd, he eluded the supervision of the hospital staff and escaped. A week later, he was arrested in Colusa, California. During this arrest, Hatcher falsely claimed that his name was Richard Lee Grady. After the police exposed his lie, he was sent back to the state hospital in California for another psychiatric evaluation. In April 1972, the staff at the state hospital determined that his treatment had been unsuccessful and that he posed a danger to other patients. So he was transferred to the Prison State Hospital in Vacaville. 4 months later, Hatcher was moved to San Quentin State Prison to stand trial again. He was ordered to undergo 2 psychiatric evaluations. The first confirmed that Hatcher was competent to stand trial, while the second determined that he was sane at the time of the crimes. In January 1973, Hatcher was sent to the California State Hospital as a sexually disordered person. However, despite his current identity as Peder, Hatcher still harbored the desire for freedom. On March 28th, a security guard found Hatcher hiding inside a cooler near the hospital's main courtyard, with 2 sheets stuffed in his pants to help him climb over the barbed wire fence. After being deemed by doctors to still pose a threat to society, Hatcher was once again sent back to court for sentencing. In April, Hatcher was sentenced to 1 year to life and was sent to a medium-security prison in Vacaville. 1 month later, a psychologist found Hatcher to be a manipulative, institutionalized sociopath. As a result, the psychologist recommended transferring him to a maximum security prison. However, upon hearing this news, Hatcher attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. Later, a psychiatrist diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and he remained at Vacaville. In August 1975, guards reported that his parole review performance was satisfactory, and a year later, the California Parole Board confirmed that his condition had indeed improved significantly. and they set his parole date for December 25th, 1978. Due to the passage of a bill that allowed the time served by inmates in both prison and mental hospitals to be credited toward their sentences, he was released to a halfway house in San Francisco on May 20th, 1977. But for Hatcher, new starts mean new crimes. Over the next 3 years, Hatcher, under the alias Richard Clark, continuously committed offenses and was admitted to mental institutions. First time, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a 16-year-old teenager. Second time, he was apprehended for attempting to stab a 7-year-old boy. Third time, he was taken into custody for an attempted assault and sodomy on a 17-year-old teenager. However, before committing these crimes, Hatcher had already committed a murder. On May 26, 1978, 4-year-old Eric vanished in the downtown area of St. Joseph, Missouri. In the end, his body was discovered along the banks of the Missouri River. He had suffered sexual abuse and died from asphyxiation amid extreme agony. The police launched a swift investigation, questioning over 100 potential suspects, including all known individuals with criminal records in the town, but they never found concrete evidence. Among the over 100 potential suspects was a man named Melvin Reynolds. At 25 years old, his intelligence and sexual orientation had been affected by the sexual abuse he endured during childhood. However, these circumstances, along with his homosexual experiences, led the police to suspect that he was the killer. Melvin, with limited intelligence, although uneasy about the investigation, still underwent multiple interrogations over several months, including 2 polygraph tests and 1 hypnotic interrogation. In December 1978, Melvin underwent his first hypnotic interrogation, during which the police administered amibarbital to him. In those days, this drug was referred to by the police as a truth serum, as they believed it could relax and calm a person, thereby eliciting a truthful confession from the suspect. However, in reality, the drug could cause hallucinations and memory impairment, and suggestive questioning by the interrogator could implant false memories in the suspect's mind. During that interrogation, influenced by the drug, Melvin made some ambiguous statements, which further intensified the police's suspicions. 2 months later, the police brought Melvin in for a second round of interrogation, which lasted 14 hours and was filled with promises and threats. Under the immense pressure from the interrogators, Melvin, with his limited intelligence, succumbed and said, "I'll say so if you want me to." In the following weeks, Melvin embellished his confession with details that the police had intentionally or unintentionally provided to him, which was enough to persuade the prosecutor to charge him. In the end, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. On July 29, 1982, 11-year-old Michelle went missing, vanishing in the downtown area of St. Joseph, Missouri, just like Eric had. The next day, her uncle found her naked and ravaged body on the banks of the Missouri River. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Meanwhile, Hatcher was arrested by the police while registering at the state hospital in St. Joseph, though details of his arrest were not disclosed. While awaiting trial, Hatcher confessed to 15 additional murders dating back to 1969. He stated that his first victim was 12-year-old William, and to substantiate his claims, Hatcher drew an extremely rudimentary map that guided searchers to the remains of 28-year-old James Churchill, who was buried in Davenport, Iowa. And then, he admitted to the murder of Eric, leading to the release of Melvin from prison. Although Hatcher confessed to multiple murders, he was only charged with 2 counts of murder, those of Michelle and Eric. In October 1983, he was convicted of Eric's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 50 years before parole eligibility. In 1984, he was convicted a second time in Missouri for the murder of Michelle. He requested the death penalty, but the jury refused and recommended a life sentence on December 3rd. 4 days later, the notorious Hatcher was found dead in his solitary confinement cell at Missouri State Penitentiary. Although his hanging was ruled a suicide, some inmates called into a local radio talk show to insist that Hatcher had been murdered. December 7th, 1984, Hatcher's death day. His life was filled with lies, deceit, and sin. It was a journey steeped in darkness and tragedy. Hatcher's actions not only brought pain to countless families, but also mired him in a quagmire of evil from which he could not extricate himself. Each of his arrests and releases seemed like a last chance granted by fate, yet he never managed to seize them. In the city of Troy, New York, there's a chilling story that still circulates through the streets and alleys. Gary Charles Evans, a man who transformed from a notorious thief into an infamous serial killer. His life was filled with theft, crime, and tragedy. In those days, he led a gang specializing in stealing antiques, and they even stole a 1,000-pound marble tombstone. He committed 5 murders, and 3 of them were his own accomplices. In the prison interview, Evans displayed a complex personality. He could kill and dismember his victims without hesitation. However, when the officer mentioned the child of one of the victims, he struggled to hold back his emotions. His eyes welled up with tears, and his voice trembled as he said, "I'm a heartless criminal. This is your only blackmail to me. You have to protect the children at all costs." So why did he display such a complex personality? Let's go back to the early years of this criminal. Abuse and verbal abuse are the shackles some parents use to bind their children. Though adulthood may bring physical escape, the distorted values implanted in childhood go on to define a lifetime. On October 7th, 1954, in Troy, New York, Flora gave birth to her first child, Evans. In the following years, she had another girl, Robbie. However, the family's happiness did not last long. After the 2 pregnancies and frequent beatings from her husband, Flora gradually fell into depression. She spent her days crying and in a state of anxiety, unable to take care of Evans and Robbie. Their father, Laroy, a man with a volotyper who was extremely fond of using violence to solve problems, was equally incapable of taking care of the children. In their childhood, Evans and Robbie grew up in a family environment filled with violence and instability. Their father's irritable temper was like a time bomb that could explode at any moment. He not only beat the children, but also did not spare Flora, who was suffering from depression. In those dark days, Evans and Robbie also witnessed their mother's multiple unsuccessful suicide attempts. According to Robbie's recollection, at the age of 7, Evans once grabbed a butcher knife and attempted to stab his father, who was beating his mother. Evans later recalled that he was sexually abused by his father at the age of 8. In such dire straits, Evans revealed a yearning for beauty, possessing an innate sensitivity toward artworks and precious objects. Also, at the age of 8, Evans first experienced the thrill of stealing. He stole a piece of jewelry worth $1,000. Although he was caught soon after, the experience did not frighten him. Instead, it revealed to him a new sense of freedom. At school, he began to frequently steal books, comics, and other small items, and occasionally he would risk shoplifting. Even though these actions made him a notorious thief, he didn't care at all. In 1968, Evans' life underwent a change. In order to cure her depression and escape her violent husband, Flora chose to divorce. She moved to Cohoes with Evans and started a new life. In the summer of 1970, Evans was arrested for breaking into someone's room and was sent to a juvenile detention center, where he had to stay for 3 months. While Evans was in detention, Flora's life also fell into chaos. She began to drink heavily, trying to numb her pain with alcohol. In just a few months, Flora even married and quickly divorced 4 men. After Evans was released, he was further shocked and confused to learn that his mother had publicly come out as a lesbian. Then, the relationship between Evans and his mother was extremely strained. They constantly argued over trivial matters. In the end, the frequent quarrels suffocated Evans, and he made the difficult decision to run away from home, drop out of school, and end up on the streets. Later, in the prison interview, Evans said that his nights spent in abandoned buildings and junkyards were extremely tough. In the winter, without warm clothes, he suffered greatly, but it was still better than the family life he had fled. When talking about his parents, Evans said painfully and disappointedly that they were not good people and were incompetent parents. In the mid-1970s, Evans returned to Troy, a city that was both familiar and strange to him. There, he reconnected with his childhood friends, Michael Falco and Timothy Reisdorf. The 3 of them rented an apartment together, and Evans also found a job. On January 13, 1977, Evans was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison for trespassing and theft of property in Lake Placid. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora to serve his sentence. Within the high walls of the prison, time seemed to drag on endlessly, and Evans gradually developed an interest in fitness. During his incarceration, his father, Leroy, passed away from throat cancer. On March 21, 1980, Evans was granted parole and returned to the shared apartment in Troy. In order to make money, he and Michael, along with Timothy, began a series of robberies and thefts. They also turned their shared apartment into a hideout for selling stolen goods. In June of the same year, Evans was arrested again for theft and was detained in the old Rensselaer County Jail. After entering a prison, Evans deliberately provoked several Hells Angels members, saying things like, "I bet you can't throw me over that fence." However, they actually threw him over it, and eventually, Evans climbed the barbed wire fence and escaped from prison. The Hells Angels is an international outlaw motorcycle club founded in California and is considered an organized crime group. But Evans' freedom did not last long. Just 5 hours later, he was recaptured and sent back to Clinton Correctional Facility. In 1982, after a fierce brawl among inmates at Clinton Correctional Facility, Evans was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility, where he remained until his release on December 29th. Just a month later, he and Michael committed several petty thefts and moved to Florida. On February 5th of the same year, Evans's mother, Flora, died after falling and hitting her head on a car bumper. This accident forced Evans to return to New York State with Michael to attend his mother's funeral. In addition, they got in touch with Timothy and resumed their criminal activities. 2 months later, Evans was arrested in Saratoga County for burglary and unlawful entry. For the remainder of that year, he was transferred between various prisons multiple times but was never brought to trial, and eventually, he was released from prison in March 1984. Meanwhile, Timothy ceased all contact with Evans and Michael. No one knows why Timothy did this, but about 3 years later, during the same period, his wife gave birth to a boy. Despite Timothy's departure, the theft gang of Evans and Michael did not disband. With Michael's assistance, Evans continued his criminal career. On February 16, 1985, they robbed an antique collector's apartment and made a profit of about $15,000. Just 2 months later, Evans stole a car and sold it for $12,000. However, the car belonged to 2 drug dealers who caught Evans, severely beat him, and handed him over to the police in Cohoes. Later, Evans accepted a plea deal with the prosecutor in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting to charges of robbery and illegal possession of a weapon. Evans then promised to stop stealing and find a good job before he was granted probation. However, fate seemed to have laid out another path for Evans. In July of that year, he would commit his first murder. In those days, he didn't understand what murder meant. But in the prison interview, he choked up and said, "I would rather be a thief forever. This is not what I wanted." When asked what turned him from a thief into a murderer, he replied bluntly, "I think it was mainly the long years in prison." In the last few days of July 1985, Evans built an improvised silencer for his pistol and used it to kill his accomplice, Michael. He then dismembered the body with a chainsaw and called Timothy, asking for his help in disposing of the body. Although Timothy was extremely hesitant, he still agreed. They stuffed Michael's body into a sleeping bag and drove to the Lake Worth corridor, Florida, where Evans's sister, Robbie, lived. And there, they buried the body in a swamp near Robbie's house. In the prison interview, he revealed that he didn't kill his accomplice to keep the loot for himself, and it certainly wasn't out of greed. Another account suggests that his motive for killing Michael was revenge, because Timothy told him that Michael had been selling the stolen goods to Timothy and keeping the profits for himself, without sharing any with him. After staying in Lake Worth corridor for about 6 weeks, Evans and Timothy returned to New York. Later, Evans was arrested again for parole violation and sentenced to 4 years in prison. There, he met his close friend, the notorious serial killer, David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. The two became friends due to their shared interest in bodybuilding. Even after Evans was released from prison, they often corresponded, sharing their lives and thoughts with each other. However, life in prison was not peaceful. In December 1987, Evans had a fight with an inmate who had sexually abused children, for which he was placed in solitary confinement for several months. But for Evans, he could not tolerate anyone harming children. This anger stemmed from his own miserable childhood. He had a strong weightlifter-like physique. He did not eat meat, poultry, or fish, and he did not smoke, drink alcohol, or use drugs. He was a person with almost no weaknesses, except for one: children. Because he had suffered pain himself, he could not turn a blind eye to those who harmed children. On March 1st, 1988, Evans was released from prison again. Soon after, he met a 27-year-old thief named Damian Cuomo and began to commit crimes with him. From March 1988 to September 1989, they carried out a series of successful thefts and robberies, becoming increasingly skilled in their criminal activities. During this period, they were also arrested, and the police found ski masks, stun guns, radio scanners, and ropes in the trunk of their car. However, due to insufficient evidence, both men were released. On September 8, 1989, Evans shot and killed 63-year-old thrift store owner Douglas Berry while robbing a store in Watertown. Then he and Damian stole items worth $15,000. By December 29th, Damian showed signs of depression. Since Evans's mother had also suffered from severe depression, he feared Damian might inform the police. Thus, he shot and killed him. In the early 1990s, Evans moved back to Florida, where he stayed for a few weeks before relocating to California. There, he encountered a woman he had known for 15 years. However, shortly after, he was arrested for threatening the woman and her husband because she refused to have sex with him. Facing potential criminal liability, he accepted a proposal to leave California in exchange for them not pressing any charges against him. Back in New York, on October 17, 1991, Evans murdered 36-year-old secondhand thrift shop owner Gregory Yelvin. He stole several items and sold them for a total of $60,000. Later, he discarded the murder weapon and buried it in the Albany Rural Cemetery in Menons. While there, he removed a 1,000-pound marble tombstone and successfully sold it. After killing Gregory, Evans decided to retire from his criminal career. In the following years, he worked as a temporary laborer, but occasionally, he still indulged in petty theft. For instance, in 1993, he stole cufflinks worth $1,500 from a group shop in Quechee. Later, he broke into the Norman Williams Library in Woodstock, Vermont, and stole a valuable book titled The Birds of America, and the original hand-painted edition of which was worth millions of dollars. In January 1994, the dealer who had purchased the marble tombstone chose to call the police and implicated Evans, and he was arrested for theft and vandalism and was ordered to serve a 1-month sentence in Albany County Jail. After his release, he moved to Vermont, where he adopted a survivalist lifestyle, living in a tent and trying to distance himself from his crimes. However, justice may be delayed, but it never fails. In June 1994, the police found Evans again because he had stolen the Birds of America. Faced with the threat of a life sentence, Evans revealed the location of the book and returned it in perfect condition. He was sentenced to only 24 months at an undisclosed prison in Vermont. On June 6, 1996, he was paroled and returned to New York. There, he rekindled his partnership with Timothy, and the two rented a storage unit in Colony to store tools and stolen goods. As time went on, Evans became increasingly paranoid, suspecting that Timothy would betray him to the police. On October 3, 1997, driven by fear and suspicion, he shot and killed Timothy. He dismembered it, buried the remains in the woods, and carefully handled the murder weapon. In reality, his paranoia stemmed from the fact that since the mid-1980s, the police had been constantly tracking him. He suspected that they had bugged his car, and to confirm his suspicions, he even spent 5 hours on a rainy rooftop wearing night vision goggles. Later, Evans stated that Horton, the officer who had been tracking him for years, had pursued him like a hound for many years, tirelessly gathering any evidence that could lead to a conviction, no matter how trivial. To evade Horton's pursuit, Evans lived on edge, moving to 3 or 4 different apartments each year, and frequently residing in motels. On May 27, 1998, a woman, the former lover of one of the men Evans had murdered, identified his hiding place to the police. At that time, Evans was in the downtown area of St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Horton and the officers jumped out of their cars, drew their guns, and surrounded him. And finally, a police dog successfully captured Evans as he tried to flee. Despite being arrested, Evans initially faced only charges of violating his probation and theft. The murders he had committed had not yet been discovered by the police. During an interview, he appeared unusually calm, stating that he had no worries wherever he went because he had long accepted his bleak future. Several days later, in a new round of interviews, Evans made an unexpected decision. Against his lawyer's advice, he confessed to killing 5 men. At that time, Horton informed him that a little boy was wondering about the whereabouts of his father, unsure if he had been abandoned. That boy was Timothy's 9-year-old son. Hearing this news, Evans struggled to hold back his emotions. His eyes welled up with tears, and he said, "I'm a heartless criminal. Yet, he made me feel sympathy for that innocent child who needs to know the truth. This is the only leverage he has over me. You have to protect the child at all costs." When the police emphasized that the 2 murdered shopkeepers had not been involved in any criminal activities, he retorted that these people were not innocent. They had knowingly purchased stolen goods from him. When asked if he regretted killing his victims, Evans candidly said, "Those people were all criminals. They were my accomplices. So I felt no pity. These words may sound cold, but they are the truth." He then added, "I feel more sorry for the children. I never intended to do that. I would rather be a thief forever. This is not what I wanted." On June 24th, Evans sat in the interrogation room, facing the police's questions. He described each of the killings in detail and revealed the burial locations of Michael and Timothy. His descriptions were so precise that the police were able to find their remains very smoothly at the specified locations. On August 12, 1998, Evans was arraigned in the Rensselaer County District Court and charged with 3 of the murders. Later, he was transferred to Albany County Jail, where he was charged with violating his parole in the local court. 2 days later, on the way to Troy and passing over the Menon's Bridge, Evans, despite being handcuffed and shackled, used a hidden key concealed in his nostril to unlock his restraints. He then shattered the window of the transport vehicle and jumped out. Although the police quickly cornered him, he managed to run to the edge of the bridge and leaped over. However, instead of landing in the center of the river, he struck the shallow waters below. In the end, he sustained a fatal head injury and died instantly. Given the circumstances, his death was ruled a suicide. Horton, Evans' attorney and investigator, along with several other acquaintances, stated that Evans had planned his suicide well before the incident. He had sent them a suicide note expressing remorse and his inability to cope with the pain of loneliness. Later, Evans' neighbor called Horton to inform him that Evans had a will, in which he requested to be cremated, and expressed a desire for Horton to receive his ashes. Evans' story, like his life, was fraught with contradictions and complexities. He was a soul struggling in the darkness, choosing death as a means to end his suffering, a final release from his inner turmoil, and a punishment for his crimes. Before starting this video, what kind of person do you think will report the location of the victim's body to the police after committing murder? Sacramento, located in Central California, near the confluence of the Sacramento River and the American River. It is the state capital with a strong police force and public security system, but also has a disturbing dark side. Several notorious serial killers have inflicted endless fear and suffering upon the residents of this city. The Golden State Killer Joseph targeted couples in his crimes, deriving twisted pleasure from sexual assault and murder. His modus operandi was extremely brutal. He would tie up the male in the bedroom and then take the female to another room to assault her sexually. During that time, the male could only endure extreme mental torment, while the female suffered abuse. Even those who were not killed by him also had their spirits shattered. The Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, his crimes were more terrible, and what he did was the most primitive horror. After killing people, Richard would drink their blood, eat their internal organs. Police even found human tissues and brains in his refrigerator. However, in addition to Joseph and Richard, Sacramento also had another lesser-known serial killer. He was called the Sacramento Slayer. active between 1986 and 1987, and brutally murdered 7 local women. This man was Morris Solomon Jr., a man from Albany, Georgia. Just like the question at the beginning of the video, for some unknown reason, he suddenly reported to the police the location where he had hidden the body of his victim. On June 18, 1986, Sacramento police received a disturbing call. Someone said that he had smelled the odor of decaying corpse. The person who reported the body was Morris, a handyman who worked near Oak Park. He claimed in the call, while repairing a house, he had smelled a nauseating odor, and as a Vietnam War veteran, he was certain that it was the smell of decaying corpse. However, when the police arrived at the scene, they found the situation to be far more complicated than what Morris had described. The victim was a sex worker named Johnson, who was also a drug user. Her body was tightly bound with ropes, half naked, grotesquely lying in a cupboard. Just 1 month later, on July 20th, another female body was discovered. This time, the corpse was found near a collapsed house. The victim was a 25-year-old woman named Angela, who was also a sex worker and drug user. Her body was bound and wrapped in bedding, clearly having been deliberately concealed. As investigations and confirmations progressed, the police found that both victims seemed to have some connection with Morris, who had reported the discovery of Johnson's body. Her time of death was just a few days before Morris made the report, during which time Morris had been conducting repair work in that house. Although Angela's case initially appeared unrelated to Morris, subsequent investigations revealed that he had once lived in that house. Eliminating all possibilities of coincidence, some police officers believed that Morris might have reported the location of Johnson's body in an attempt to mislead the police, making them think he was a concerned citizen rather than a killer. Given these suspicions, police brought Morris to the interrogation room, and there, his behavior seemed to confirm their suspicions. Firstly, Morris was unable to accurately provide his own identity information, and his statements were riddled with contradictions. However, despite some police officers being convinced that Morris was the killer, without solid evidence, they could not detain or arrest him. They could only take Morris's fingerprints and blood samples. In early 1987, Sacramento was home to 2 serial killers. One of them was Dorothea, who ran a boarding house, specifically catering to the elderly, frail, drug and alcohol addicts, and those with mental health issues who were homeless. These unfortunate individuals became her victims, and their remains were buried in her backyard. Moreover, the reason Morris's serial murders did not attract much attention was that a year after his arrest, Dorothea was also apprehended by the police. As one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history, second only to Eileen, the sensational nature of her case completely overshadowed the serial murders committed by Morris. The other serial killer was Morris, whose crimes had yet to be discovered by the police. On March 19th, in the basement of a house near Oak Park in Sacramento, a female body wrapped in a bedsheet was discovered. Upon identification, the victim was a woman named Maria, who was also a sex worker and drug user. At this point, the police had already realized that a serial killer was active near Oak Park in Sacramento. The 3 victims shared some disturbing similarities. They were all sex workers and drug users, had been bound in a similar manner, and their remains were found partially naked. These details led the police to conclude that there was only one killer behind these cases. After Maria's body was found, the police once again brought Morris to the interrogation room. There, the man provided some false statements, but his lies were quickly refuted by the police. Eventually, Morris admitted that he had given vague information about his identity because he had 4 outstanding arrest warrants, so he chose to lie in an attempt to evade the police investigation. In reality, since the discovery of the first victim, despite the police's extreme suspicion of Morris, he had cooperated with them. On April 20th of the same year, he agreed to let police search his abandoned car in the area where he lived. But when the police arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed a distinct depression in the soil near the abandoned car, so they grabbed a few shovels and began to dig. As time went on, their efforts were rewarded with a shocking discovery. They found the body of 26-year-old Washington. Unlike the previous victims, she was the only one woman without a prostitution record. Her body was also half naked and tightly bound with ropes. 2 days later, the police discovered 2 more victims behind an aging shack associated with Morris. Linda, 24-year-old, Sheila, 17-year-old, had been dead for about a year. In the following days, the police also found Sharon's body near the burial site of Maria. At that time, there was no direct evidence proving that Morris was the killer. There were no fingerprints or DNA traces. The police and prosecution mainly based their charges on 2 points. First, almost all the victims were found near places where Morris had lived, and some sex workers and other witnesses testified that Morris was the last person the victims had contact with before their deaths. During the trial, Morris's defense attorneys proposed an extensive plan for mitigation of punishment. Over the course of 7 days, they found 18 witnesses to testify, attempting to reveal the complex psychology behind Morris's crimes. Their strategy was to attribute Morris's actions to the abuse he suffered in his childhood, his service in Vietnam, and the effects of cocaine use. 2 forensic clinical psychologists testified that the abuse Morris endured in his childhood led to mental, emotional, and behavioral issues in his adulthood, which had an undeniable connection to his crimes. Despite the efforts of the defense attorneys which led to the dismissal of the murder charge against Morris in the Angela case, he was still convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Later, although his death penalty trial was declared a mistrial, in July 1992, the second jury unanimously voted to sentence Morris to death again. When the details of the case were made public, some of Morris's surviving victims came forward and bravely shared their experiences, allowing people to better understand the brutality of this serial killer. 18-year-old Mary testified that she was stabbed with a knife by Morris on September 19, 1969. Dale testified that Morris kicked her in the face on May 17, 1971. Connie described the nightmare of October 18, 1975, when Morris put a chain around her neck, choked her, assaulted and raped her, and urinated on her face. In addition to these cases, Morris was convicted of felony assault and false imprisonment in 1977. He was also charged with the murder of a masseuse, but was acquitted due to the absence of the prosecution's witness. In 1984, Morris was sentenced in Arizona for 3 counts of grand theft. Ultimately, Morris became the 342nd person sentenced to death in the state and was incarcerated on death row at San Quentin Prison. On July 15, 2010, the California Supreme Court reaffirmed his conviction once again. Only a few people knew that Morris was not only a convicted criminal with a history of sexual assault and brutality, but also had been institutionalized in a state mental hospital, where he was diagnosed as a criminally insane individual. As Morris's defense attorneys argued, Morris's story is one filled with pain and darkness, with his life trajectory largely overshadowed by the shadows of his childhood. On March 15, 1944, Morris was born in a remote rural area of Georgia, where he also spent his childhood. His grandmother, Bertha, took on the responsibility of raising him, but unfortunately, her parenting was characterized by violence. As a child, Morris would often wet the bed, which should have been a normal occurrence for any child, but Bertha used it as an excuse to abuse him. She would place the young Morris across her lap and mercilessly raise her hand, striking him over and over again. Sometimes, a mispronunciation on his part would also become a reason for Bertha to vent her anger. Even Morris's instinctive crying during the abuse was seen by Bertha as a provocation, which only led her to become more violent. Bertha's methods of abuse were cruel and varied. She would order Morris to strip naked, stand on a stool, and then take a wire and lash out at his exposed body, focusing particularly on his genital. Sometimes, Bertha's violent outbursts were without any reason. She would suddenly fly into a rage, tie Morris's hands to the bedpost to prevent him from retreating during the beating. During the first 13 years of Morris's life, he had very little contact with his parents. They seemed like distant strangers, their figures blurred in his memory. It wasn't until the day when Bertha and the family moved to Ileton, a small farming town 40 miles south of Sacramento, that Morris finally reunited with his parents. However, this so-called reunion brought Morris no warmth, but instead plunged him into an even more chaotic and painful world. In Ileton, there was an area known as Cannery Row and Tin Pan Alley. It was impoverished and dilapidated, with run-down houses lining the streets. Morris's family was one of the few African-American families in this small town, and they lived in that very place. In there, Morris witnessed his parents' mutual verbal abuse, physical fights, and even incidents of sexual violence. His mother and grandmother would also beat and berate him in public, with no regard for his feelings. Some relatives described Morris's mother as a promiscuous woman who was aggressive and lacked empathy, and who engaged with different men as a sex worker. Despite the difficult environment in which he grew up, Morris still tried to move forward. After graduating from high school, he entered a community college and attempted various jobs, including carpentry, auto repair, and bus driving. Later, he enlisted in the military. Starting in the summer of 1966, he served in Vietnam for a year during the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1967, he was discharged as a sergeant and returned to Ileton. During this time, Morris had become engaged to a girl he had met before going to Vietnam, but for some reason, the girl broke off the engagement. Later, Morris moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he got married and had a daughter. However, due to the impact of both his family life and the war, his mental state became very unstable. After committing some minor offenses, his wife divorced him and took their daughter away. In the end, Morris moved back to Sacramento. There, he found work as a handyman, repairing old houses in exchange for free room and board, and began his career as a killer. In Morris's previous appeal, his lawyers mentioned his experience in Vietnam. They said that during those chaotic times, soldiers could cheaply hook up with Vietnamese women anywhere, even in the battle zone. These young women were also victims of the war. They were treated as objects and toys by soldiers. Like many other soldiers, Morris slowly lost his way in that environment. On August 1st, 2024, at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California, Morris was declared dead. But his death was not a simple natural demise, but rather concealed some inside story. According to insiders from the institution, a death row inmate, William Ramos, had struck Morris on the head with a metal object, causing him to die from blunt force trauma to the back of his head. William, 72 years old, had been sentenced to death for the murder of 3 women. An email revealed more of the inside story, including that on June 26th, Morris had a physical altercation with William and was sent to an external medical facility for emergency care. Morris returned to prison on July 29th and was declared dead on August 1st. Miami is one of Florida's major cities, and it has a thriving economy that attracts people from neighboring countries like Cuba and Colombia to try to illegally enter Miami in pursuit of the American dream. However, the arrival of these immigrants has brought some serious problems that cannot be ignored. For instance, violent crime, sex industry, and drug trafficking. Among these problems, sex workers are particularly vulnerable. To make a living, they must entertain numerous clients and endure physical exhaustion and pain. This harsh reality often leads some to drug addiction, which in turn makes them easy prey for serial killers. On September 17, 1994, in the area around Flagami, Miami, a man's body was found in a dimly lit alley. He was dressed in revealing clothing, with heavy makeup on his face and obvious strangulation marks on his neck. Miami police quickly transported the body to the forensic office and began questioning nearby sex workers, trying to identify the victim. Obviously, the revealing clothes and heavy makeup made the police come to the initial conclusion that the victim was a sex worker. After a series of investigations and verifications, the victim's identity was eventually confirmed as Lazaro, a 27-year-old man who used to be a hairdresser. Lazaro harbored a secret deep inside. He believed he was a woman, so he always dressed in women's clothing and asked people to call him Vanessa or Jessica. However, this psychological struggle left Lazaro on the fringes of society. Eventually, due to financial difficulties, Lazaro fell from being a hairdresser to becoming a transgender sex worker, living in a cheap motel room. And the night before his death, Lazaro was still soliciting clients on the street, but no one knows who was his last client. In order to find clues, police went to the motel, and in the room they found some drugs and syringes. In those days, the death of a drug-using sex worker would hardly attract people's attention. Police also would not invest much effort, because no one knew whether his death was related to the drugs. 3 weeks later, on October 8th, another death occurred. Elisa, 44-year-old drug-using sex worker, was found dead. Although her body was found near Florida International University, her death did not receive the attention it deserved. In this area filled with cheap motels, adult stores, and strip clubs, her death was just one of many tragedies. The deaths of the two victims did not attract much people's attention until November 20th, when another naked female body was found on a path in West Dade. The victim was 23-year-old Nava. This case drew high attention from the police and the media because the killer left some sarcastic messages on the victim's back and buttocks. He wrote, "Third, see if you can catch me." The killer did not use the word see, but replaced it with two eye symbols. Obviously, the words reminded the police that Nava was not the only victim. The previous victims were also the killer's prey. Therefore, the police took swift action, trying to find clues from the messages left by the killer. However, the killer seemed to always be one step ahead. 5 days later, on November 25th, another murder occurred. The body of 38-year-old Wanda was found in the parking lot of an apartment building. Unlike the previous victims, Wanda died of suffocation instead of strangulation. Due to the different method of killing, the police initially excluded this murder from the series of serial killings. The Flagami area, Florida International University, West Dade, and the location of Wanda's death. Although the crime scenes of the four victims were not in the same place, a trail connects them all together. Tamiami Trail. Apparently, the killer's active area was around this trail. Although the police had not yet disclosed the existence of a serial killer to the public, residents living in this area had already begun to panic. Wanda's death made them realize that the area was no longer safe. As a result, many residents who worked in the area moved away, fearing that they might become the next victims. On December 19th, the police finally admitted that there was a serial killer on Tamiami Trail, because on this day, another female body was found in a residential area near Tamiami Trail. The victim was 28-year-old Schneider, a homeless person who had been arrested several times for prostitution. Based on the victim's identity and the location where the body was dumped, the police concluded that since September 17th, an unknown serial killer had been committing crimes near the Tamiami Trail, targeting street sex workers. Miami police also set up a temporary command post there to investigate the murder and named the serial killer the Tamiami Trail Strangler. On January 12, 1995, the police found the last victim near the Tamiami Trail. Rhonda, a 21-year-old sex worker, was the victim. In reality, after realizing that the killer specifically targeted sex workers, police had warned the sex workers in the area to stay away from this chaotic region, especially for Rhonda. Just 1 week before she was murdered, a police officer had told her not to continue soliciting clients in there. At the press conference announcing the victim's identity, a senior police officer said that the killer was desperate for attention, but he hadn't received the attention he needed recently. So he tried to attract everyone's attention and prove his existence through this brutal murder. Later, he added, according to the psychological profile of the killer established by the FBI, they describe the attacker as neat-minded, with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, conflict-avoidant, and likely to have a regular job. This means that after the crime he might be exhausted or behave abnormally, and you will find changes in his living habits. He will no longer be the same person. His colleagues, or perhaps important partners in his life, will notice the changes, and this is the kind of clue we hope to receive. This serial murder case also triggered the largest manhunt in the history of Miami-Dade County. During the investigation, more than 100 investigators and FBI profilers worked around the clock, following up on as many as 5,000 leads at a cost of nearly $2 million. However, despite investigating over 1,000 potential suspects, no meaningful results were produced. Nevertheless, police did not give up. They continued to patrol near the Tamiami Trail, and at the same time, through community activities, they called on the public to provide any possible clues. On June 19, 1995, residents of the Trail Highlands Garden Apartments reported to the police that they had heard strange noises coming from their neighbor Rory's apartment. Before long, the police, having received the report, arrived at the scene. Rory was not at home, so they directly broke into the apartment and found a naked, bound woman. She was 30-year-old Gloria. Upon seeing the police, Gloria cried and explained that while soliciting clients, she had encountered Rory. He had paid her and requested that she provide sexual services at his home. However, after the service was over, he had immediately strangled her. Fearing for her life, Gloria pretended to be dead in order to survive. Fortunately, she successfully deceived Rory. Meanwhile, Rory, the owner of the apartment, had just finished a court hearing for a robbery charge unrelated to the case. As he approached his apartment, he noticed that it was surrounded by police. So, he pretended that nothing had happened and left, but his escape could not dispel the police's suspicion. He had become a major suspect. Gloria, a sex worker, being bound, all pointed to the fact that Rory was very likely the Tamiami Trail Strangler. 5 days later, Rory was arrested at his grandmother's house in Hialeah. Police officers also obtained a search warrant to search Rory's apartment and his car. Ultimately, DNA samples linked Rory to 5 of the 6 victims. When the police brought Rory to the interrogation room, Rory appeared unusually calm. Faced with the police's questioning, he voluntarily confessed to his crimes, saying that he was the serial killer who had been committing crimes near the Tamiami Trail. Rory said, "I killed these women because my wife left me. I lost her, so I needed to find a way to fill the emptiness inside." In subsequent interviews, Rory even claimed that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with the corpse of one of the victims. The arrest also shocked Rory's neighbors and friends. In their eyes, Rory was a quiet, normal, and family-loving man. Although he seemed to become more reticent after his wife left him, no one ever thought that he was a serial killer. One neighbor recalled, "We thought he was just going through a tough time." However, the police found a chilling fact from the behavior of Rory's friends and neighbors. It turned out that Rory was able to escape the police for so long because his friends and neighbors had seen him behave strangely many times, but never reported it to the police. Once, the neighbors saw Rory stealthily peering into a young woman's bedroom in the early morning hours. On another occasion, the neighbors saw he dragged a suitcase containing unknown contents to his car in the night. What's more shocking is that during a discussion with colleagues about the ongoing manhunt, Rory referred to the killer as a smart person the police would never catch, and no one doubted Rory's words. Later, Rory was charged with 6 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of theft. Before his trial, a Spanish-language newspaper obtained court records of Rory's confession. The records revealed that he had talked to the victims' corpses and blamed them for the misfortunes in his life. Several lawyers later said that because of Rory's confession and too much evidence against him, they tried to make Rory's confession inadmissible in court on the grounds that the police had not fully informed Rory of his right to hire lawyers. However, the prosecutors pointed out that the police had treated Rory well on several occasions, even allowing him to call his family and giving him bathroom privileges before he decided to plead guilty. In October 1999, Rory went on trial for the murder of Rhonda. Due to the complexity and severity of the case, he had to be tried separately for each murder, and the first trial was for Rhonda's murder. The violent and brutal way Rhonda was killed drew great people attention. When Rory remained silent, the judge read that the autopsy showed Rhonda's body had 30 neck fractures. In the end, Rory was found guilty of murdering Rhonda and was sentenced to death. In 2001, as part of a plea agreement, Rory admitted to the remaining 5 murders. In exchange, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, and was prohibited from trying to overturn the sentences. Rory said that he killed these women because his wife had left him. His words seemed as if he was the real victim. However, such words only made people more convinced that his words were full of lies. But to fully understand Rory's behavior, one needs to go back to his past, June 14, 1965, the day he was born. He was born in Barranquilla, Colombia, and his life was filled with hardships from the moment he was born. When Rory was only 6 months old, his mother passed away from tetanus, leaving him and his sister to be raised by their grandmother, Maria. At the age of 12, Rory's life took a turn when he and his sister moved to Miami to live with their father. At that time, his father was an airline employee who had recently remarried, and the relationship between Rory and his father was not harmonious. Rory felt that his father was extremely emotionally distant and even abusive towards him, while his father believed that his son was just introverted and too lonely. It is said that Rory was sexually abused by two of his uncles, which led to severe depression, post-traumatic stress, and issues with low self-esteem. Rory's future wife, Carla, thought that Rory's angry outbursts might be the result of sexual abuse by his father, but these claims were never verified. Rory and Carla's love story began in 1985. At the time, 20-year-old Rory met 15-year-old Carla through a friend party. 2 years later, they got married and eventually had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Although many neighbors thought Rory was a friendly and helpful person, the arguments between Rory and Carla were already an open secret, as they often escalated into violent conflicts. Once, when Carla was pregnant, Rory drove her out of the apartment naked. In 1989, the couple moved into their own apartment, after which Rory's abusive behavior became more frequent. He repeatedly punched, kicked, and choked Carla, threatened her, and even pointed a gun at her. One evening in 1991, Carla came home early from work. While cleaning the apartment, she found a videotape in the VCR. Out of curiosity, she played it and was shocked to see another woman wearing her lingerie, masturbating in bed. When Carla confronted Rory about it, he not only failed to provide a reasonable explanation, but also attacked her. Over the next 3 years, Rory and Carla went through multiple breakups and reconciliations. Gradually, Rory stopped having sexual relations with Carla and began to leave home frequently, claiming he was going fishing in the Florida Keys. However, that was not the case. In mid-1993, Carla decided to follow Rory after work and saw that Rory was actually peeping into the bedrooms of young women, watching them and masturbate. In early 1994, Rory became a salesman for building supplies. His colleagues at the company had a fairly positive opinion of him, describing him as helpful and outgoing. However, they were unaware of his violent behavior towards Carla and his frequent peeping at young women. Around July of that year, Carla finally made up her mind to leave Rory and took their 2 children with her. In a fit of anger, Rory threatened her, saying that if she dared to date another man, he would kill her. A month later, Rory tried to force Carla to come back to him, but she firmly refused and made it clear that she wanted a divorce. As a result, Rory's mental state deteriorated completely. A month later, he went to the red light district, looking for a sex worker to satisfy his physical needs. However, the sex worker he found was Lazaro, a man disguised as a woman. He paid for sexual services, but during the encounter, he discovered that Lazaro was a man. Driven by some kind of rage, Rory strangled Lazaro and killed him. According to Rory's confession, after killing Lazaro, he knelt on his body for 10 minutes, blaming Lazaro for making him lose his wife and children. In 1995, a few months after Rory's arrest, sex workers on the streets of Miami were once again plunged into a shadow of terror. A new demon had extended its evil claws towards these people who were struggling to survive on the fringes of society. In August, the body of the first victim was found in the Alapata neighborhood of Miami. The victim was 43-year-old Vida from North Carolina. During an interview, a police officer claimed that the Alapata neighborhood was known for drug users, and he believed that Vida might have chosen to set herself on fire after having hallucinations from drug use. However, the forensics report showed that Vida had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which clearly indicated that Vida was not a suicide but had been brutally murdered. 2 months later, the police found another body just 100 yards from where Vida had been discovered. The second victim was 44-year-old Diane, a drug user who had been wandering the streets for 15 years. Her body also bore signs of having been bludgeoned with a blunt object and then set on fire. Initially, her identity could not be determined due to the damage caused by the fire. It was only after the forensic used dental records and licenses that her identity was finally confirmed. 3 months later, on January 25, 1996, the body of 37-year-old Cheryl was found in the Old City Cemetery in Miami. Her body had suffered severe blunt force trauma, and there were obvious signs of burns. Shortly after, the police received a report of another body found in an abandoned gas station. Like Vida, Diane, and Cheryl, this victim was also found half naked, with signs of blunt force trauma to the head and burns on the body. The victim was identified as 37-year-old Janice, a woman with mental issues and a drug addiction. Notably, investigators found a set of male footprints near the scene of Janice's death. All the victims had similar lifestyles: prostitution, drug addiction, and homelessness. The similarities in these cases led the police to realize that a serial killer might be active in the Allapattah neighborhood and the surrounding streets. After Cheryl's body was discovered, the local police department established a special task force dedicated to investigating these cases. They deployed 100 investigators, conducted extensive inquiries among local sex workers and drug users, involving approximately 500 individuals. They also collected 10,000 pages of suspect information, most of which turned out to be false. However, based on the leads they gathered, they created a composite sketch of a person nicknamed Fear, whom they believed to be the suspect. One police officer stated that a witness had seen him with the body shortly after the third victim's body was discovered. He believed that this person nicknamed Fear could also be a witness, but he added, "We don't know if he's a suspect in the killings or a witness to the killings. All we know is that we need to talk to him." On one afternoon, a woman flagged down a patrol car on the street. She told the police officers that a man had tried to lure her closer and wanted to attack her with a blunt object. Fortunately, she managed to escape before the attacker could strike. The officers comforted her, encouraging her to go about her life and reminding her to call the police immediately if she saw the man again. At that time, no one could have thought that the woman had helped the police arrest the murderer. Not long after, the woman found the man who was trying to attack her. She waved to the patrol car without hesitation and pointed at the man. The police officers responded quickly. They immediately stopped a middle-aged bald man riding a bicycle, and his name was Francisco. After a preliminary examination, the two police officers realized that they might really have caught the culprit. There was a container full of gasoline and matches in the bag on the back seat of Francisco's bicycle. When asked why he was carrying gasoline, Francisco tried to explain, "Oh, my bicycle chain occasionally falls off. When I repair it, my hands get covered in grease. So I need gasoline to clean the grease off my hands." However, this excuse was clearly unconvincing. Because the police had already documented the footprints left by the murderer, they asked to inspect the soles of Francisco's shoes. After a careful comparison, they found that Francisco's footprints matched the murderer's exactly, and then he was taken to the Miami Downtown Police Department for further interrogation. In the interrogation room, a police officer observed that Francisco showed hardly a trace of remorse in his demeanor. He appeared cunning and methodical, as if every move he made was carefully planned. When the police asked him about his thoughts on the murders of women who were beaten to death and then burned, Francisco merely downplayed it, saying that the murders were indeed terrible. The first interrogation mainly focused on Francisco's childhood in Cuba and his personal preferences. From his account of his childhood, the police learned that his comfort zone was the beach. To understand his psychological state, the police took him to the beach on Biscayne Bay. There, the police and Francisco were drinking coffee from Cuba and looking at the sea, and then Francisco admitted that he was the killer of the 4 victims. On August 3, 1957, Francisco was born in Cuba. He was the first child in a family that had long been plagued by mental illness. From a young age, he was ostracized and avoided by his peers, with loneliness and helplessness accompanying his growth. His father was mostly away working, and when he came home, he would abuse him. In such a family environment, the only place where Francisco felt safe was on the Cuban beach with his mother. And in reality, from the age of 3, Francisco began taking anti-epileptic drugs. By the age of 16, he started experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. Hallucinations that led him to firmly believe that everyone around him was somehow hurting him. Francisco told the police that he heard the voice of Santeria, the voice of a religious witch. The witch had black facial paint, which also explained why his victims were all black women. After admitting to being the murderer, the police took Francisco to the crime scenes. There, he meticulously reenacted each crime, providing details that only the murderer would know. In May 2003, a court hearing was held for Francisco's case. The court ruled that due to his severe mental illness, they could not sentence him to death for the 4 murders. In the end, Francisco was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Looking at the criminal history of the world, victims of murders and serial murders have shown some highly concentrated identity characteristics. For example, historically the most frequently persecuted groups, sex workers and the homeless. Their low social visibility and weak ability to protect themselves mean that their disappearances will not attract much attention. In other words, killing them poses almost no risk. Next in line are young girls, who have little social experience and are easily lured by strangers. Even when girls go missing, it rarely draws attention. For the police, the girls might be runaways or eloped with someone. Hikers are also one of the targets of serial killers and violent criminals. They often venture into remote forests and mountainous areas, where even if they encounter danger, it will not be noticed by others. By the time their families realize something is wrong, what the search dogs bring back are often lifeless remains. David Joseph Carpenter, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. In just 3 short years, he killed at least 7 young women who were hiking. But the crimes committed by this monster throughout his long life were not limited to these. In his youth, he committed multiple cases of rape and assault. And in order to attract attention, while Joseph was in prison, he even claimed to be the Zodiac Killer. On May 6, 1930, with a cry from the delivery room of a hospital in San Francisco, Joseph came into this world. Unfortunately, his father, Elwood, was a hot-tempered man with a fondness for alcohol, while his mother, Frances, had a strong personality and tended to be rather domineering. Clearly, growing up in such a family, Joseph's childhood was filled with nothing but pain and no happiness. Why life had become so bad? At first, neither Elwood nor Frances had a clear answer. They could only complain about the unfairness of life and society. However, with Joseph's arrival, the otherwise ordinary couple realized that they could so completely dominate another life. At the age of 3, Joseph wet the bed, which was his first bedwetting incident. However, Frances dragged him to the backyard, forcibly placed the bedsheet over his head, and poured the remaining soapy water onto his head. From the age of 4, Joseph was forbidden to speak with children his own age. On one occasion, after Joseph was caught playing outside with a neighbor's child, he was locked in a pitch-black room by his parents. There, no windows, only darkness. The boy had a stutter due to fear and panic. In order to draw everyone's attention, Frances also forced Joseph to learn the violin and ballet. She would take up a stick and abuse Joseph whenever he made a mistake. As time went on, Joseph attended Glen Park Elementary School, where his classmates mimicked his stutter. Hearing this, young Joseph would furiously lunge at them, only to be pushed down into the trash can by several of them together. Because of this incident, teachers invited Frances to the school and explained the situation to her. They suggested that Frances enroll Joseph in speech therapy to treat his stutter. However, as a mother, Frances flatly refused the teacher's suggestion. At the age of 10, Joseph was accused of biting a playmate. When he returned home, the hot-tempered Elwood took a belt and began to beat Joseph. A few days later, when Joseph returned to school, his arms and ankles, which were not covered by clothing, were covered in severe bruises. Having endured countless abuses, Joseph's character became reclusive and violent. He began to abuse animals, venting his anger on the defenseless little creatures. Later, Joseph, then 15 years old and attending Balboa High School, stood in the hallway and dragged a female classmate down the stairs by her ankles. In light of this assault, school administrators expelled Joseph on grounds of violent tendencies. But the moment he heard the girl scream, Joseph experienced a peculiar psychological shift. A psychologist later wrote that sexual rage fused with the trauma of early abuse and humiliation, successfully molding Joseph into a dangerous man. After being expelled from school, Joseph turned his attention to more vulnerable children. He committed sexual assault, a crime involving the use of sexual innuendo or physical violation to arouse or satisfy sexual desire, with his 2 cousins among the victims. At the age of 17, Joseph was arrested by the police for the first time. He was suspected of sexually assaulting a 3-year-old girl. Initially, he was detained in the holding room of the California Youth Authority. However, due to mental health issues, he was transferred to Napa State Hospital. In a yellowed probation report, when questioned by the probation officer, Frances impatiently said, as soon as he was able to walk, he was getting into trouble. In 1950, Joseph, 20-year-old, was accused of raping a 17-year-old girl. In court, the girl cried hoarsely when she testified. However, Joseph was not guilty. In the mid-1950s, Joseph became a fisherman on a storage ship. Around the same time, he married Ellen, a girl who likes to chat on the balcony, married a stuttering husband. In the next 5 years, they raised 3 children. During this time, Joseph resigned from his job as a fisherman and found employment at a post office in San Francisco. And it was there that he met Lois, a 32-year-old woman, the future mother of television personality Lisa. On July 11th, 1960, Joseph, dressed in his postal uniform, had no letters in his canvas bag, only a knife and a hammer. At that time, he lured Lois to a grove of trees. There, Joseph first stabbed Lois' hand with the knife. As Lois fell to the ground in a panic, Joseph swung the hammer and smashed it into her. Fortunately, an officer was nearby and witnessed Joseph's assault. To prevent Joseph from further harming Lois, he fired and wounded Joseph. Later, Lois survived and, in great confusion, told the prosecutor that Joseph, who usually stuttered, did not stutter at all when he attacked her. Additionally, Lisa was born 3 years after the assault. Meanwhile, Joseph was taken to the interrogation room. When asked why he had attacked Lois, he said that he had seen a movie, Psycho, and then he dreamed of his mother standing at the bathroom door with a hammer in her hand. So, he wanted to try that feeling. In the end, Joseph was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. In his first year in prison, Joseph divorced Ellen. During his imprisonment, the man behaved well and even obtained a high school diploma. Because of this good behavior, Joseph was released from prison in 1969. Additionally, he married his second wife, a woman named Helen, who was also a poor woman. This is because, after marrying her, Joseph began his crazy sexual assaults. In 1970, Joseph went on a crime spree in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first incident occurred when Joseph deliberately rear-ended a young girl's car. After the violent collision, the girl got out of her car to check the damage and talk to Joseph. However, Joseph pushed her to the ground and sexually assaulted her. And then, Joseph took a shovel from the trunk of his car, stabbed the girl, and quickly drove away from the scene. Days later, a 19-year-old girl was hiking in Boulder Creek when Joseph attacked and sexually assaulted her with a hunting knife. On February 3rd, Joseph forcibly entered the home of 45-year-old Lucille. There, he tied her wrists, demanded her car keys, and sexually assaulted her. With her car keys in hand, Joseph drove to Angel's Camp. Along the way, he flagged down another vehicle carrying a 21-year-old young mother and her son. He first sexually assaulted her and then forced her to drive him to Oakdale. Upon arrival, Joseph ordered the mother and child out of the car and drove away alone. In the early hours of February 4th, an investigator named James arrested Joseph. With Helen's permission, James searched their car and found the hunting knife used in the second assault. Meanwhile, the real Zodiac Killer was sending ciphered letters from San Francisco, and the media was frantically searching for information about this serial killer. However, in order to draw everyone's attention, Joseph, while in prison, claimed to the inmates that he was the Zodiac Killer. Initially, the police mistakenly believed that Joseph was the Zodiac Killer, but as the investigation progressed, they discovered that when the Zodiac Killer had committed 3 murders previously, Joseph had still been in prison. Thus, Joseph's suspicion was ruled out, and the media also abandoned their focus on him. However, losing people's attention was also one of the reasons why Joseph became a serial killer. In the late night of April 26th, Joseph, together with 5 other inmates, pried open the iron window of their cell and escaped from the Calaveras County Jail. 2 weeks later, Joseph was captured. At the sentencing hearing, due to a plea bargain, he was only convicted of theft and kidnapping. In addition, the psychiatrist concluded that the prisoner suffered from antisocial personality disorder, was good at manipulation and lying, and lacked remorse. At the same time, he also warned that since the age of 8, whenever Joseph was under significant stress, he would commit sexual offenses. The only way he could think clearly was by sexually assaulting women. On August 20th, 1979, Etta, aged 44, was found dead on a hiking trail in Mount Tamalpais. Etta was a bank clerk in Mill Valley and an experienced hiker. The day before her body was discovered, her husband had seen her alive. At the crime scene, Etta was found naked with a gunshot wound to the head. Coincidentally, a few days before the crime, a special pistol had been reported missing, and the owner was an acquaintance of Joseph. The gun was never recovered, and this clue made Joseph the prime suspect in Eda's murder case. However, there was no evidence to prove that Joseph was the killer. 2 months later, Joseph killed 23-year-old Mary in Montana. On October 21st, Mary was jogging on a path when Joseph dragged her into the bushes in an attempt to assault her. During the struggle, Mary fought back fiercely and twisted Joseph's thumb. In a fit of rage, Joseph stabbed her more than 20 times in the back, throat, chest, and abdomen, with the neck wound being so deep that it almost decapitated her. Nearby residents heard Mary's long and piercing screams, but they assumed that a patrol car would handle it, and no one attempted to save Mary or call the police. Soon after, Joseph went to the emergency room, lying that his thumb had been bitten by a dog. At 4:30 in the afternoon, several hitchhikers followed the bloodstains on the path, found Mary's body. On March 8, 1980, 23-year-old Barbara was stabbed to death on a secluded trail in Mount Tamalpais. A few days later, her body was found in the bush, curled up like a fetus. After the crime, the sheriff of Marin County publicly urged women never to hike alone. The officers also found a pair of glasses nearby, similar in style to those worn by Joseph, but the police failed to connect this clue to Joseph. In the fall of the same year, Joseph falsely claimed that he wanted to join the mafia and asked his former prison book club friend Molly to buy him a revolver priced at $230 in San Leandro. At first, Molly was extremely hesitant, but Joseph promised that if anything happened and the police found her, she could just tell them that the gun had been stolen. So, Molly bought the revolver and handed it over to Joseph on October 2nd. 9 days later, a new murder occurred. On October 11th, 19-year-old Richard from Sonoma County and his 18-year-old fiancée Cynthia were strolling along the Skyline Trail at Point Reyes National Seashore's Sky Camp. Joseph used the revolver bought by Molly to force the couple to kneel and then shot each of them execution style before leaving the scene. With no news for several days, Cynthia's parents and the Coast Guard, where Richard was serving, filed missing person reports. However, someone claimed to have seen Cynthia 3 days after she went missing, leading the police to mistakenly believe that Richard and Cynthia had eloped. It wasn't until Richard and Cynthia's 1974 Toyota Corolla was found by the police in the parking lot at the start of the Reyes Trail that the rumor of their elopement was debunked. 3 days later, on the afternoon of October 14th, Joseph wandered into Mount Tamalpais State Park. At that time, 26-year-old Annie was cycling alone. She had just returned to the San Francisco Bay Area a few months ago. There, Joseph dragged her into the woods, raped, and shot her. The next day, Annie's father, a respected doctor in San Rafael, reported her missing. Later, the search team found her body about a quarter of a mile east of the amphitheater. A month and a half later, on November 28th, 22-year-old Diane, a graduate of Cornell University, disappeared while hiking at Point Reyes National Seashore. The next day, she was found naked, dead from a gunshot wound. In the same area, the police also found 23-year-old Shauna, a native of Pullman, Washington. She had also been shot dead on the same day as Diane. A few days later, the remains of Richard and Cynthia were discovered as well. A week after Diane's murder, the police identified a local fugitive, Mark, as a suspect. He was a former rock singer who was wanted for shooting his mother and brother and had fled from his home in the Tamalpais Valley. The sheriff publicly named him as a suspect in Diane's and several other murders. However, Mark, while on the run, wrote a letter arguing that while he had indeed killed his mother and brother, he was not involved in the other murders. Later, Mark was soon apprehended, but the killings in Marin County did not cease, leading to his exclusion as a suspect. The following year, Mark admitted to the murders of his mother and brother and was sentenced to life imprisonment. In early December, the 6 hiking-related murders were linked together by the police, and the FBI developed a criminal profile, describing the killer as someone who derived pleasure from sadism and psychological torture, harbored a deep-seated hatred for women, and used killing as a means to alleviate his ever-accumulating urges, yet he could never be truly satisfied. On December 4th, a man claiming to be the killer made 3 phone calls to the Marin County Sheriff's Office. He mocked the FBI's criminal profile that depicted him as a broken child. Over the next 2 days, he made 14 more calls, repeatedly stating his intention to surrender. However, on December 6th, he fell completely silent. Despite receiving over 750 tips from across the nation, As far as South Carolina, the police did not have a single credible suspect. On March 29, 1981, Joseph traveled south for over 90 miles, shifting his hunting grounds to Henry Cowell Redwood State Park in Santa Cruz County. At that time, Joseph was on the lookout for targets from an observation deck when he spotted 20-year-old University of California, Davis student Hanson, and her same-age Stephen walking along a secluded trail overlooking Monterey Bay. Joseph took out his gun, stopped Hanson and Stephen, and bluntly told Hanson, "I'm going to rape you." Naturally, upon hearing such a demand, Hanson flatly refused him. Immediately afterward, Joseph took the couple to a place far from the road. He first fired several shots into Hanson's head, causing her to die on the spot. He then shot Stephen in the neck. Fortunately, the shot did not kill Stephen, but merely rendered him unconscious. After Joseph left, Stephen regained consciousness and struggled to find nearby hikers for help. In the end, although Stephen's vocal cords and optic nerves were severely damaged, his injuries fully recovered over time. On May 2nd of the same year, Joseph committed his final murder. The victim was 20-year-old Heather from San Jose, who worked as a printing assistant at the same trade school as Joseph. That day, Joseph invited Heather to meet in Santa Cruz under the pretext of selling her a used car at a low price. Before setting off, Heather informed her mother and her boyfriend Peder of the meeting plan. Upon hearing the news, considering the multiple murders that had occurred locally, Peder advised Heather not to go. However, Heather believed that even if she encountered the killer, she would be able to handle it. What she didn't know was that Joseph was indeed the serial killer who had harmed many people. After meeting, Joseph first drove Heather along the highway to Big Basin State Park. There, Joseph, armed with a gun, forced Heather to undress, raped her, and then shot her dead, leaving her body where it was. On May 24th, several hikers discovered a decomposing body. 2 days later, the victim's identity was confirmed as the long-missing Heather through dental records. In reality, in March, just a few hours after Hanson's body was discovered, based on the pattern of the crime, the Santa Cruz County Police linked the killer to the serial killer in Marin County. The same close-range shooting, the same method of disposing of the body, and the same random selection of victims. Moreover, subsequent forensic records proved that the bullet that killed Hanson and the casings from 3 murders in Marin County all came from the same pistol. Therefore, Stephen, the only survivor of the multiple murders, became the key to capturing the killer. At that time, Stephen was lying in the hospital. Due to his neck injury, his vocal cords and eyes were in an extremely painful recovery period. Despite this, he insisted that the officers bring him paper and a pen. He wrote while describing in a hoarse voice that the killer was around 50 years old, very thin, bald, and about 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall. On the day of the crime, he was wearing a baseball cap, a trench coat, and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. A local resident, Fritz, also came forward to confirm the accuracy of Stephen's description. He stated that he had indeed seen this man in the park that day, and after the murder, the man had left in a red car. Hearing this, the police were completely taken aback, because their previous description of the killer was entirely that of a young man in his 20s or 30s, which was completely different from the description given by Stephen. But all in all, having an accurate description was a good thing. Thus, 2 composite sketches based on verbal descriptions immediately replaced the previous sketch of a man in his 20s with brown, medium-length hair, which had originally come from the vague recollection of a hiker in Marin County. Immediately thereafter, the police launched an 18-hour-day tip hotline and nailed warning signs at the entrances of all parks in Northern California. Hike with a partner, and exercise caution when entering hiking trails alone. On April 4th, 1981, 69-year-old resident Roberta walked into the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office holding a newspaper with the composite sketch. She told the deputy on duty that the bald man in the drawing looked very much like Joseph, whom she had known for many years. Roberta's memory went back to 1955. At that time, Joseph was a fisherman aboard a storage ship. He would often visit her home and showed an unpleasant familiarity towards her 14-year-old daughter. In 1960 and 1970, the local newspaper twice reported Joseph's arrest for sexual assault. Hearing this, Roberta said, "I'm not surprised at all." And then the officers connected Roberta's identification with the descriptions given by Stephen and Fritz. In his early 50s, thin, bald, horn-rimmed glasses, and a red car. All these details pointed to the same person, Joseph. Moreover, records showed that Joseph was the last person Heather had contact with before she disappeared. On the morning of April 5th, 7 investigators split into 2 groups and quietly set up telescopes on a low hill next to Glen Park to conduct a 24-hour surveillance on Joseph's red car. For an entire week, they documented his routine of leaving home at 5 in the morning and returning at 6 in the evening. Occasionally at night, he would take an unusual route to the Big Basin Highway. Meanwhile, the laboratory compared Joseph's tire tracks with those left in the soil at the Hansen crime scene, and the results were a match. On the morning of May 14th, Joseph was arrested outside his residence in Glen Park, San Francisco, by the FBI agents. He was immediately handcuffed and taken to Santa Cruz. The officers, armed with a search warrant, entered his apartment and found a Sierra Club-published California hiking map book on the living room bookshelf. Several pages were conspicuously marked with paper clips. Each page corresponded to the locations of the crime scenes for Hansen, Heather, and several other murders in Marin County. However, despite the strong circumstantial evidence provided by the map book, the prosecution was still worried because the murder weapon used by Joseph had not yet been found. On May 15th, the jury formally indicted Joseph on 1 count of murder for Hansen. At that time, Heather's body had not yet been found, so no additional charges were added. On May 24th, Heather's body was discovered by several hikers, and 2 days later, her identity was confirmed. On the same day, the prosecution added a charge of murder for Heather. However, Joseph loudly pleaded not guilty to both charges. The breakthrough in the cases did not occur until July. In early July, a criminal named Williams, who had been arrested for a robbery in Los Angeles, revealed to the police that he had hidden a gun for Joseph in exchange for a reduced sentence. He and Joseph had become friends in prison in 1978. After their release, he sought out Joseph, hoping to continue his life of robbery. Joseph then lent Williams the revolver used to kill Hansen, Heather, and others, which is why the police did not find the murder weapon in Joseph's house. Acting on this crucial lead, the officers followed Williams's directions and found a revolver in the mountains of Santa Cruz. After ballistic and rifling comparisons, the gun was confirmed as the murder weapon, and its serial number was traced back to Molly. Initially, the police had approached Molly, but she lied to them, claiming the gun had been stolen. When the police threatened Molly with a charge of conspiracy to commit murder, Molly immediately changed her story, admitting that she had fulfilled Joseph's request to buy the gun and had handed it over to him personally. On July 31st, the Marin County jury, based on ballistic evidence, added 5 more murder charges against Joseph. Up to this point, Joseph faced a total of 7 murder charges, 2 rape charges, and 1 attempted rape charge. And the Santa Cruz district attorney promptly requested that the Hansen and Heather cases be consolidated for trial, citing the same killer, the same pattern, and the same weapon. In 1982, to avoid media coverage influencing the jury, Joseph was transferred to Los Angeles County for trial. Ultimately, after several delays, on May 24, 1984, the trial for the murders of Hansen and Heather, as well as the attempted murder of Stephen, officially commenced in a Los Angeles courtroom. In his opening statement, the district attorney, Arthur, informed the jury that they would hear firsthand how Stephen witnessed the bullets spinning in the chamber and saw his companion being killed right before his eyes. Arthur then cited a phone call Heather had made to her boyfriend before her death, indicating that the last person she saw was Joseph. The public defender for Santa Cruz County, Wright, cautioned the jury that the prosecution's arguments were based on speculation, hunches, and doubts, and that all testimonies would be scrutinized during cross-examination. After several days of deliberation, the defense admitted that Joseph had killed Hansen and Heather, but urged the jury to focus on the issue of capacity and to consider a lesser sentence. They highlighted Joseph's traumatic childhood, where he was beaten by his mother and forbidden from playing outside, instead being forced to endlessly practice the violin and ballet. Child abuse experts testified that it was the long-term abuse by his parents that led Joseph to become violent. The prosecution countered by stating that while a tragic childhood can indeed shape one's character, it does not affect an individual's ability to make choices. On July 5th, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Joseph guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of attempted rape. They also determined that special circumstances existed, making him eligible for the death penalty. On October 5th, despite repeated appeals from the defense and the public regarding mental and psychological impairments, the jury rendered a formal verdict. The judge even publicly stated in the courtroom that if there was a case deserving of the death penalty, this was it. On November 26th, Joseph was transferred to San Quentin State Prison and locked into a gray single-story cell in the death row unit. 3 weeks after sentencing, Joseph was transferred to Marin County to face charges for the 5 hiking murders. Fast forward to May 10, 1988. After years of waiting and deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder, with 2 counts of rape and 1 count of attempted rape. The local judge similarly stated that the heinousness of the case warranted only the ultimate punishment. Ultimately, Joseph was once again taken back to San Quentin's death row to await what was called the gas chamber trial. It is well known that the death penalty in California is almost a joke. After years of waiting, the victims' families never saw Joseph's execution. Instead, in 2019, the governor of California announced that the death penalty was suspended. In 2023, the state government decided to transform San Quentin State Prison into a center for rehabilitation and reflection, effectively eliminating the traditional death row. Although Joseph's death sentence remains valid, it will no longer be carried out. In 2024, Joseph contracted COVID-19. A year later, due to his inability to walk and take care of himself independently, Joseph was transferred to the California Medical Facility in Stockton, where he continues to serve his death sentence between a wheelchair and a hospital bed. Whether in the 20th or the 21st century, it is terrifying that murder cases have never been far from us. In Charlotte, North Carolina, a homeless black man, for no apparent reason, killed a Ukrainian refugee. The girl had come to the United States to escape the war. She actively integrated into her new life, working 3 jobs during the daytime and attending community college at night to study English. She believed in the rules of society and looked forward to a better future. However, while waiting to get off the bus, an 8-centimeter folding knife was plunged into her body. The girl did not turn around, nor did she have time to cry out. She simply sat there quietly, waiting for her life to end. After World War II, the crime rate in the United States soared rapidly, reaching its peak in the 1970s and the 1990s. Meanwhile, this period was also a time when serial killers were extremely rampant, with various notorious serial killers constantly appearing in people's eyes. For example, Ted Bundy, who committed murders and rapes across multiple states. Green River Killer, who indiscriminately murdered women and claimed to be cleaning up society's trash. Richard Chase, who liked to eat the victim's internal organs and blood. In reality, in those days, there was also a highly skilled and extremely brutal serial killer lurking. In the early stages of his criminal career, he was not particularly noticeable, primarily gaining experience in breaking into people's homes through theft. As time went on, he became dissatisfied with mere theft and gradually shifted his targets to single women, broke into their residences to commit sexual assaults. Later, his behavior became even more brutal, and his targets expanded beyond single women to include couples and married couples. He would carry a handgun, break into the victims' homes, force the women to tie up their partners, and then sexually assault the women. In the end, his criminal activities reached a climax because he began to kill the victims. It is worth noting that at first, the police were misled by his different targets and scattered crime locations, believing that these cases were committed by 3 different criminals. They separated these cases and named them the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker, respectively. In the early 1970s, Visalia, California was a quiet town. Agriculture dominated the area, with farms and ranches dotting the surrounding countryside. But this small town harbored a peculiar and puzzling phenomenon. Nearly all the houses had no windows. This situation arose from the unique economic conditions of the time. In those days, glass was prohibitively expensive due to high tariffs. Furthermore, the price of hiring local carpenters was high, and they were very arrogant and rude. Without windows, the interior of the houses would be extremely dim, so the Visalia residents never locked their doors. While this lifestyle reflected the town's tranquility and safety, this lack of vigilance also made it the perfect place for thieves to gain experience in burglary. From 1974 to 1975, a series of unusual thefts occurred in here. In some homes, piggy banks and coin jars were ransacked. Strangely, valuable items were left untouched. What's more, it seemed that the intruder was not satisfied with mere theft. He would meticulously arrange or display items in the victim homes, even move window screens to beds or bedrooms, leaving obvious traces. Clearly, these actions bear little resemblance to the typical methods of a thief. They do not resemble the impulsive, opportunistic actions of a random burglar, but rather the calculated, premeditated actions of a predator. So, the intruder was given a nickname, the Visalia Ransacker. The first recorded burglary committed by the Visalia Ransacker took place on March 19, 1974, when a resident's piggy bank containing $50 in coins was stolen. Later, similar home burglaries began to occur frequently, especially on November 30, 1974, when 12 burglaries took place within a single day. Snelling, a 45-year-old and highly respected journalism professor, was awakened around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 11, 1975, by a strange noise. He got out of his bedroom and saw the back door wide open. Following the source of the sound, Snelling ran to the carport and found an attacker wearing a ski mask attempting to kidnap his daughter. The attacker, holding a gun, threatened to kill the girl if she didn't shut up. Seeing his daughter about to be harmed, Snelling didn't hesitate to rush forward and try to protect her. However, 2 bullets struck Snelling's body, instantly draining him of his strength. Staggering back to the bedroom, he told his wife to call the police. In the end, Snelling died, and the attacker beat Snelling's daughter and then fled the scene. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 12, 1975, an intruder broke into the backyard of a house in Visalia, near where the Visalia Ransacker was known to frequent. William, an experienced police officer, was in the garage on surveillance when he spotted the intruder. Immediately, William drew his pistol, attempting to apprehend him. Just as William was about to seize the intruder, the man stopped, raised his hands above his head, and feigned surrender. However, just as William let his guard down, the intruder pulled out a revolver and fired at William, shattering his flashlight. Although the arrival of nearby police officers to help William, the intruder managed to escape. In the end, the police only found fragments of the flashlight at the scene, tracks of tennis shoes, and the intruder's dropped loot, some blue chip stamps, and a sock filled with coins. On June 18, 1976, around 5 in the morning, Phyllis, age 23, trembled as she called the Sacramento County Police Department's emergency line. She claimed that she had been attacked and sexually assaulted in her home. The details of this case were repeatedly mentioned by the police in the days that followed. The attacker wore a ski mask and gloves throughout the crime, threatening the victim with a weapon. He applied baby oil in advance as a lubricant, tied up the victim, and then raped her. The attacker's penis was very small, and he would steal inside the house, but he would not take valuable items, only take personal items that were meaningful. Moreover, Phyllis stated that the attacker had already stripped his body before entering her room. For experienced police officers, the implications behind this behavior were self-evident. They concluded that this was a juvenile sex pervert who could not control his sexual impulses, and it was only a matter of time before he was arrested. A criminal profiler once said that most people can easily associate high-intelligence criminals with sophisticated and complex robberies. However, when it comes to rape and torture, people often regard it as a degenerate act and rarely associate it with high intelligence. Therefore, people are reluctant to believe that such criminals possess intelligence, and neither do the police. However, the Sacramento County Police never imagined that they were dealing with anything other than an ordinary rapist. Just 3 months later, on October 5, 1976, the 5th sexual assault took place, with Jane as the victim. Around 6:30 in the morning, Jane's husband had just left for work, and she was still in bed with her 3-year-old son when she suddenly heard the light in the room flickering on and off. Soon after, a man wearing a green mask appeared before her. Later, Jane's son was placed in another room, while she was blindfolded and taken to the living room. During the sexual assault, the man asked Jane, "How does this compare to the captain's?" At the time, Jane's husband held the rank of captain in the Air Force, and the man also kept slapping Jane, saying, "Put some feeling into it, or I'll use a knife." When Jane's 3-year-old son woke up, all he saw was his mother bound with a bath towel, gagged with a cloth, and with marks on her wrists. As time went on, more and more evidence came to light, pointing to an unsettling fact. The attacker's crimes were not random but meticulously planned. For instance, several weeks before Phyllis was assaulted, she received a few mysterious phone calls and seemed to be followed while walking outside. And looking at Jane's case, her husband had just left the house when the attacker entered through the window of the spare bedroom. He was like a cunning nocturnal creature lurking in the shadows, screening victims, studying the structure of houses, familiarizing himself with the daily routines of people in the area, carefully planning the timing of his crimes, and being cautious, patient, and meticulous. Since the attacker always wore a mask and gloves, deliberately lowered his voice when speaking, chose times and rooms with poor lighting for his crimes, and considering that the victim's memories were not entirely reliable, the only features the police knew were that he was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, relatively young, well-built, with well-developed calf muscles and had a small penis. In order to apprehend this rapist, the police embarked on a difficult manhunt. They began by conducting a thorough search of suspects with similar criminal records, inquiring with neighbors in the area, and visiting suspicious individuals such as couriers, milkmen, and cleaners. Police also attempted to reenact the crime scenes, blindfolding Jane and having her listen to recordings of 2 suspects to identify the rapist. Additionally, they carefully searched pawn shops in an effort to locate the stolen items. They even visited an adult store to inquire about customers who showed interest in bondage-related materials. Ultimately, they found that a man had inquired about women's registration information at the Department of Motor Vehicles. However, when the officers interviewed this man at his doorstep, he appeared agitated, stood in a gutter, completely oblivious to the water dirtying his clean leather shoes. This small detail made the police realize that they had the wrong person, and thus, the man's suspicion was dismissed. That October, 500 Sacramento County residents attended an emergency meeting about the serial rapist. They anxiously voiced their fears to police officers, hoping law enforcement would swiftly bring this monster to justice. The next day, a newspaper report struck like a sledgehammer, sending fear soaring once more. The East Area rapist had committed his 8th consecutive assault. In those days, given the attacker's operational territory, he was dubbed the East Area Rapist. The East Area Rapist's targets were relatively focused, mainly on women who were home alone, including a minor girl, 15-year-old named Crease. Before Crease was assaulted multiple times, the man left a chilling threat. He said, "Do what I say or I'll kill you and be gone in the dark." At the time of the crime, the girl was playing the piano. Later, she never touched the piano again. Crease said that although it was only a few hours, it changed everything. On March 18, 1977, the Sacramento County Police received a call from a man who claimed to be the East Area Rapist. He taunted the police, saying, "My next victim is already being tracked. You will never catch me." On the same day, the 15th sexual assault took place. Later on, hurt single women and causing them pain no longer satisfied the East Area Rapist. As a result, couples and married couples became his primary targets. On April 2, 1977, he assaulted a couple for the first time. In this attack, he employed a modus operandi that he had never used before, and it turned out that this pattern would reappear in the cases he committed later on. He first made the female victim tie up her male partner in the bedroom. This was not a simple action of binding, but a form of psychological torture. Then, he would stack a pile of plates on the man's back and say, "If I hear any of the plates fall, I'll kill her." After that, he would take the female victim to the next room to commit the sexual assault. During the time, the male partner could only stay in the bedroom, listening to the sounds coming from the next room, feeling his helplessness and despair. According to statistics, the East Area Rapist committed approximately 50 home sexual assaults and 1 murder over a span of 3 years. On February 2, 1978, a couple walking their dog in Cordova Ranch were shot to death. British criminal psychologist David once wrote that a criminal's history is more vulnerable than his future. He believes that the key to solving a series of crimes does not lie in merely the location of the most recent crime, but in delving deeply into what happened before the first crime was committed. David emphasizes that before a criminal actually commits a crime, he may not even know that he will do so. Therefore, his behavior before the crime may not be as cautious as it is afterward. On October 1st, 1979, a couple in Santa Barbara County experienced a terrifying night. At the time, an attacker wielding a flashlight woke them up with its beam. The woman was ordered by the attacker to tie up her partner. Then, she was also bound. Later, the attacker began to ransack the room, incessantly opening and closing drawers while demanding cash. However, curiously, he did not seem singularly focused on stealing money. Next, he led the woman to the living room, made her lie face down on the floor, and covered her head with a pair of tennis shorts. The woman could only hear his footsteps pacing around the room. Then, she heard him enter the kitchen, muttering the chilling words, saying, "I will kill them." Hearing these words, a powerful will to survive surged within the woman. She broke free from her bonds, ran out onto the street, and began to scream loudly. Her partner also took the opportunity to escape to the backyard of the house. Perhaps the attacker's reconnaissance work was not successful. The couple's next-door neighbor happened to be an FBI agent. Awakened by the woman's screams, the agent immediately went outside to check the situation and happened to see a man riding a stolen silver bicycle crossing the street. The man was wearing a Pendleton brand shirt and jeans, had a knife strapped to his waist, was wearing tennis shoes, and had brownish hair. After a chase through several streets, his headlights shone on the attacker. However, the attacker was extremely cunning. He decisively abandoned the bicycle, jumped over a fence between two houses, and vanished into the night. After the incident, the attacker was given the nickname Night Stalker. It turned out that the couple was fortunate because nearly 3 months later, another couple was found murdered in their home by the Night Stalker. The victims were a 44-year-old plastic surgeon named Robert and a 35-year-old clinical psychologist named Deborah. In 1980, the Night Stalker moved southward in California. He first killed Charlene and Lyman in Ventura, and then made his way to Dana Point, where Keith and Patrice, a newlywed couple of just 3 months, were murdered by the Night Stalker. At that time, the couple lived in a house owned by Keith's father, Roger. August 19th, Roger, as usual, came to visit his children but heard no sound. When he entered the bedroom, the scene seemed quite ordinary. The bed was neatly made, with the quilt covering all the way to the edge of the dark headboard. Roger thought the children had just gone out. However, as he was about to close the door, a bulge under the quilt caught his attention. He walked over and gently pressed it, feeling something hard. When he lifted the quilt, he saw Keith and Patrice lying there quietly, their arms bent at a strange angle, palms facing up. In this case, the police found signs of death by blunt force trauma. The couple had multiple wounds from being struck with a heavy object on their heads. Apparently, the murderer had used some kind of weight during the crime. On February 6, 1981, 28-year-old Manuela was raped and murdered in her home in Irvine. In fact, this murder completely disrupted the life of her husband David. At the time of the attack, David was hospitalized due to illness and was not with Manuela. However, later on, the police and neighbors always suspected that David was the murderer. But for David, the real murderer, the Night Stalker, had been constantly bothering him, such as following him and frequently calling him. On July 26, 1981, Debbie had a fierce argument with her mother, Sherry. Then, Debbie stormed out of the house in anger. In her last phone call to her mother, she shouted, "Why can't you just get out of my life?" But she didn't know that this would be the last conversation between mother and daughter, because the very next day, her mother was brutally murdered, and along with her, Sherry's ex-boyfriend Gregory also died. The Night Stalker's final crime took place in Irvine, where the victim was Lisa, an 18-year-old whose life had been as tragic as her fate. In reality, Lisa's life was filled with suffering. She had had several stepfathers, each of whom had subjected her to varying degrees of abuse. And her mother's pursuit of pleasure and drugs far outweighed her sense of responsibility towards her family. Because the house was for sale and potential buyers would be coming to view the house, on May 3, 1986, Lisa's parents went on vacation to Mexico, leaving Lisa alone at home to deal with clients interested in purchasing the house. On the morning of May 5th, Linda, the real estate agent, arrived at the house as usual to check on things. Upon entering, she noticed that the dining room light was on and the newspaper's job section was spread out on the table. Linda walked down the hallway to the bedroom at the end, where she found a girl lying motionless on the bed, seemingly covered with a blanket. Later, the police quickly arrived at the scene. They carefully lifted the blanket, which was almost stuck to the girl's body, only to discover that she was completely naked, with an unknown liquid on her legs, later confirmed to be semen. She had a wound on her forehead, a bruise on her nose, and 3 teeth were knocked out, 2 of which were cruelly hidden in her hair. It was confirmed that the victim was Lisa. Initially, the attacker was given the notorious nickname, the Night Stalker, by police. However, as another serial killer named Richard, who also operated at night, became active in the Los Angeles and San Francisco areas, the police and media changed the attacker's nickname to the original Night Stalker to avoid confusion, based on the chronological order of their crimes. Since 1986, following Lisa's murder, neither the East Area Rapist nor the original Night Stalker has committed another crime. Nevertheless, the lives of the victims have not returned to normal. They remain shrouded in fear and unease. On January 2, 1978, Phyllis, the first known victim of the East Area Rapist, received a phone call in which the caller said, "I'm going to kill you, bitch. Goddamn whore." In 2001, the Sacramento Police Department launched an investigation. They compared the DNA evidence left by the East Area Rapist with that left by the original Night Stalker. Ultimately, it was confirmed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Although decades have passed, the police and the public who followed these cases never gave up. Among them, a full-time mother named Michelle documented a vast amount of case details. She studied the composite sketches of the suspect, searched online daily for clues about this serial killer, and occasionally visited the victims' families to listen to their stories. And it was she who named this mysterious serial killer the Golden State Killer. Michelle was not the only one paying attention to the Golden State Killer. An investigator named Paul had been tracking the Golden State Killer for over 20 years. Despite uncovering a large number of indirect clues, such as the perpetrator's fingerprints, semen samples, and eyewitness testimonies, they were unable to narrow down the investigation due to technological limitations. In his quest to find the killer, Paul even tracked thousands of criminals, all to no avail. However, even Paul could not have imagined that these decades-long cold cases would see a crucial breakthrough thanks to a free website. In 2017, after many recommendations, Paul learned about a website focused on genetic genealogy research. It is well known today's society is in a rapidly changing and fragmented era where people are extremely eager to understand their racial origins and family history. Since there was no threshold fee for this website, a large number of people voluntarily uploaded their DNA data to there. Given the website's vast genetic database, Paul had a bold idea. He wanted to upload the Golden State Killer's DNA sample to the site and conduct a data comparison. Later, he shared this idea with his colleagues. Initially, his colleagues who were well-versed in law opposed it, as it might involve personal privacy and illegal law enforcement issues. However, lawyers gave Paul strong support, pointing out that the website's data had immense value for cracking the case, and that the approach was legal. So, Paul quickly took action. He obtained a well-preserved semen sample from the Ventura County coroner. In December 2017, he created an account, uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to the website. After a period of waiting, they found a person whose DNA partially matched the Golden State Killer's. Clearly, this person had some blood relationship with the Golden State Killer, or he was the killer's relative. Paul had been fighting for 24 years to capture this serial killer. Once, the number of people he tracked and suspected was countless, and with the help of modern shared analysis technology, his list of suspects gradually narrowed down from millions of people to a single family. Later, by comparing appearance, age, work experience, modus operandi, and psychological profiles, the scope was further narrowed. Finally, they zeroed in on a 72-year-old man, Joseph James D'Angelo. In mid-April 2018, the officers obtained an item discarded by Joseph. After DNA comparison, the old man was confirmed to be the killer. Michelle once wrote a letter to the Golden State Killer. In the end part of the letter, there were a few sentences. I imagine you alone in a small and dark room. You hear a car pull up to the curb and the engine shut off. You know those footsteps are coming for you. The doorbell rings. You can no longer climb the fence to escape. Take a deep breath, a big gulp of air, and clench your teeth. You can only timidly move step by step toward the ringing doorbell. You once threatened the victim, saying you would be forever silent and disappear into the darkness. Open the door and let's see your face. And this is your end. Fortunately, people have waited for this ending. Sadly, Michelle passed away 2 years before the Golden State Killer was arrested. She did not live to see this ending. The development of all things is often propelled and brought about by their essential causes. The extremely ugly and dark side that Joseph concealed can also be traced back to its origins. For most people, playing with siblings during childhood is a happy and blissful memory. But for Joseph, this period became a painful experience that tormented him for the rest of his life. During one playtime, Joseph found that his 7-year-old sister Connie had disappeared. After searching for a long time, Joseph approached an abandoned warehouse where he witnessed a shocking scene. 2 pilots were sexually assaulting a little girl. And the girl who was crying out for help with all her might was his sister Connie, whom he had been looking for. For a child around 10 years old, witnessing such a terrifying scene is undoubtedly a catastrophic psychological shock. And this painful childhood memory took deep root in Joseph's heart. Over time, it gradually transformed into despair and resentment towards real life. Joseph's personality also began to twist and become unpredictable. He started committing minor offenses, such as stealing neighbors' property, pilfering other people's mail, and torturing and killing animals. If the pain of his childhood made Joseph put on a devilish mask of hatred toward society, then his later romantic experiences were the trigger for his revenge against society. After completing his military service, Joseph met a girl named Bonnie, and soon the two fell deeply in love. This relationship gave Joseph a renewed sense of hope and beauty in life. He even announced their engagement in the local newspaper. However, 2 years later, Bonnie got married, and the groom was not Joseph, but a wealthy forensic accountant. In reality, the truth was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. It was not Bonnie who cheated on Joseph. Instead, Joseph had been the villain in this relationship. He abused Bonnie, threatened her with a gun, and even forced her to marry him. Despite all this, the relationship left a deep wound in Joseph's heart. His hatred and jealousy towards Bonnie consumed all his emotions. In many of the homosexual assaults, Joseph would stop during the crime, sobbing and shouting, I hate you, Bonnie." After his arrest, since the statute of limitations for the serial rape cases had expired, Joseph was only charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. On June 29, 2020, as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he admitted to these crimes. Additionally, Joseph confessed to the burglary and murder he committed in Visalia. Thus, the crimes of the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were all connected to one person. These heinous acts, which had once kept countless people awake at night, finally had a definitive attribution. On August 21, 2020, Joseph was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole multiple times in a row. During the trial, after listening to the victim impact statements, Joseph offered a brief apology in the face of the victims and their families' anger and sorrow. He said, "I listened to all of your statements, every single one. I truly am sorry for everyone I hurt." However, is this apology really worth accepting? This is a thought-provoking question. In fact, whether it was the multiple burglaries in Visalia or the serial rapes and murders, when Joseph committed these crimes, he was a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect the public and arrest criminals. For example, when Joseph committed the multiple burglaries in Visalia, he was working as a burglary department police officer in Exeter, just 11 miles away. Later, Joseph's daughter submitted a letter to the court, which, once made public, sparked public discussion and reflection. In part of the letter, she wrote affectionately, "I am Joseph's eldest daughter. The father I know and still know to this day. I could never tell you everything he has done for me because he always put me and my daughter first. And it has always been like this throughout our lives, so there is just so much." This letter is indeed touching. But when we stand in the shoes of the victims, imagine those who were raped and murdered. Their lives might have been better or worse than what Joseph's daughter described. No one knows. But because of Joseph, their lives were taken, their futures were stolen, and their life trajectories were completely altered, never to return to what they once were. Without Joseph, those murdered victims would definitely still be alive. Examining the history of crime globally, serial killers are arguably the most feared type of criminals. Although they may look ordinary in daily life, they will show a cruel nature and violent behavior. One of the most chilling of them is the medical serial killer. They don't need knives, guns, or ropes to kill their victims. They don't need to hide from the police, because the hospital itself is where the legal deaths place. A death, whether from a deteriorating condition or multiple organ failure, will not automatically alert the police. With no traces, no autopsies, and no archival records, even the news ignores the deaths in the hospitals. The medical serial killer commits the quietest slaughter from the safest place imaginable. Charles Cullen, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. He murdered at least 40 patients during his 16-year-long nursing life. Rumors even claim the true number of people killed could be as high as 400 people. On February 22, 1960, an unusually cold night, Charles was born in the West Orange, New Jersey. His 7th month in the world, his father, Edmund, the bus driver, never woke up in the early morning of September 17th. In his infancy, the boy did not know what death was, but he felt the pain in his mother's crying. The childhood house was old. As Charles learned to walk, he also learned to avoid the fists of his peers, the sneers of his sister's boyfriend. When he was 9 years old, Charles tiptoed into the garage to reach for a bottle of chemical solution on a shelf. The bottle felt cold, but without the slightest hesitation, he drank it. This was Charles' first attempt to commit suicide, but it failed. No one cared whether he had ingested the chemical by accident or intentionally, but from that day on, Charles lived like a ghost. Charles's mother was born in the south of England, in a town where the sea breeze blew all year round, and after the World War II, she followed her husband to America. On December 6, 1971, as the evening rain fell on the streets, Charles's mother and his sister were driving home. However, late at night, the hospital called and informed 18-year-old Charles of his mother's death, which Charles later recalled as devastating. When the accident occurred, the hospital did not tell him in time, and, in particular, it cremated the body straight away without even allowing him to go and see his mother for the last time. In the spring of 1978, Charles shoved his books in the trash. He chose to drop out of school and entered the recruiting office. He longed for a place free of ridicule, but what he didn't know was that what awaited him was a place of extreme horror. Charles became a submariner, and while he was on board, he passed confinement tests that would scare even a psychiatrist. It is well known that submariners are the most painstaking among all military personnel. Awaiting them is a narrow space without sunlight or fresh air, filled with a mixture of noise, oil fumes, and body odors. For dozens of days or even months on end, they cannot speak loudly, cannot move around freely, and cannot express their emotions openly. Here is the dictation of a submariner. From the 30th day, the sound of my mother calling me began to ring in my ears. It was not an auditory hallucination, but a very clear one, as if she were standing right behind me, calling my name. Yet, whenever I turned around, there was nothing but pipes and lamps. So I started talking to her every day, murmuring softly to the wall, "Mom, I didn't take a shower today." I know it's wrong, but I can't control that. On the 45th day, I cried in front of the pressure gauge for 20 minutes in the cabin. No one noticed. It's not because I'm tired, but because I suddenly can't remember what my girlfriend looks like. I had a photo of her, but I was too afraid to look at it. Seeing it would only make it harder to remember. One day, I was on the night shift. The temperature in the cabin was 109 degrees Fahrenheit. I was wearing a vest and sweating all over. I suddenly realized that I was dead. I became a ghost. I began to count my heartbeat, 120 times per minute. I counted for 3 hours without moving. I'm afraid that if I move, I will really die. Soon, Charles was promoted to Petty Officer Second Class. Late at night a year later, the chief sergeant pushed open the door of the missile control room. He saw Charles sitting alone in front of the control table, wearing surgical masks, latex gloves, disposable aprons, and covering his uniform tightly. The next day, Charles was transferred out of combat duty and thrown into low-stress work on a supply ship. Thereafter, he began attempting suicide in the remotest corners of the warship. However, each time he was caught in time. In 1984, he was granted a medical discharge, leaving only one line in his file, medical reason, unspecified. In order to continue to smell the disinfectant water, Charles enrolled in a nursing school at Mountainside Hospital in Montclair. There, he became the monitor of the nursing class, graduated in 1987, and began to work in the burn ward of St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. Meanwhile, Charles met his wife, and their first daughter was also born in the late autumn of the same year. In the delivery room, Charles was holding his daughter, and his wife was lying in bed. Looking at Charles, she felt that life would get better and better. However, Charles began to behave abnormally. First, there was a strange smell in the kitchen, and then their pet dog was also abused by Charles for no reason. On the night of June 11, 1988, in the cardiac monitoring ward of St. Barnabas Medical Center, Charles inserted a syringe into a patient's foreline. Inside was no life-saving antibiotic, but an intravenous drug overdose sufficient to stop the heart instantly. The 72-year-old senior judge was declared dead from a drug allergy in the early hours. This was the first murder Charles openly admitted to. Over the following 4 years, he sent at least 11 more patients to the morgue. Like a ghost, Charles wandered the wards, disguising each murder as the patient's natural complication. In early 1992, the pharmacy finally discovered several contaminated 4 bags, prompting management to launch an internal investigation. However, Charles had already submitted his resignation letter. It was only after his murderous actions were later uncovered that the investigation concluded that deaths were highly likely caused by Charles, the former nurse, and the exact number of patient fatalities could not be fully determined. After just 1 month of rest, Charles put on his ID badge again and returned to work at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg. His new stage was a geriatric ward, and his chosen weapon of murder remained digoxin. With 3 excessive doses, 3 elderly women had their hearts stopped in their sleep. Before her death, the last victim opened her eyes and vaguely said to her daughter, "A sneaky male nurse gave me a shot." The victim's family relayed this to the doctors, but it was dismissed as a baseless fabrication. In 1993, Charles' wife obtained a restraining order against him out of fear that he might pose a danger to her and their 2 children. She claimed that Charles had added lighter fluid to people's drinks, burned his daughter's books, and left their daughter with a babysitter for an entire week. Although Charles denied these allegations, insisted that his wife was exaggerating, she remained convinced that he was suffering from psychosis. After their divorce, Charles moved into a damp basement apartment. He considered resigning from his job, but the court ordered him to pay child support, forcing him to remain in the nursing profession. In the late night of March 1993, Charles pried open the door of a female colleague's home and entered the bedroom through the staircase. The woman and her son were sound asleep, but Charles merely stood by their bedside for a moment before leaving the house. No one knew why he did it. Later, he began stalking the same colleague, ultimately leading her to file charges against him. Charles was sentenced to 1 year of probation for unlawful entry. In the early hours of the day after the sentencing, he attempted suicide once again. Following this incident, Charles took 2 months off and received treatment for depression at 2 psychiatric hospitals. Surrounded by white walls, soft toothbrushes, and plastic cups for scheduled medication, he outwardly complied with taking his pills, yet still made 2 more suicide attempts during this period. In late September of that year, in the dead of night, a 91-year-old woman in the cancer ward reported that a tall, thin man, not her assigned nurse, had pushed open her door and injected her with an unknown substance. The following day, she passed away seemingly of natural causes. Her son wept over her body, crying and saying, "Yesterday, my mother said she wanted to eat pudding tomorrow." Due to mounting public pressure, hospital administrators arranged for a polygraph test. But Charles passed the test, and as a result, he continued to work at the hospital. In 1994, Charles changed the job. began working in the intensive care unit of Hunterdon Medical Center, signing a 3-year contract. For the first 2 years, Charles claimed he had not harmed anyone. However, when the police came to retrieve the records in 2003, the medical files from those 2 years had long been completely destroyed by a shredder. Charles only admitted that between January and September of 1996, he had used digoxin to kill 5 patients. Later, Morristown Memorial Hospital took Charles in, but dismissed him within less than 6 months due to his failure to meet performance standards. After half a year unemployed and with child support arrears prompting a court warning, the immense pressure led Charles to seek treatment for his depression at the emergency room of Warren Hospital. Shortly afterward, he was once again briefly admitted to a psychiatric institution. In February, the Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was severely short-staffed and immediately assigned Charles to the ventilator unit. In the early hours of one morning, a colleague saw through a door crack that Charles was holding a syringe in one hand and pressing down on a patient's wrist with the other. The next day, that patient was found with a fractured arm, and shortly afterward, Charles caused another patient's death. In the end, the hospital administration fired Charles on grounds of improper medication administration procedures, but attributed the death to another nurse's documentation error. After being dismissed, Charles promptly joined Easton Hospital. On December 30th, 1998, following the death of an elderly patient with heart failure, his blood test revealed extremely high levels of digoxin. However, the hospital's internal investigation still yielded no results. In those days, there was a nationwide shortage of nurses in the United States. Even with Charles' history of mental illness and the numerous patients he had killed, all he needed to do was switch hospitals to resume working and resume murdering patients. There was no blacklist, no mental health reporting system, and no hospital was willing to take action against Charles for fear of facing lawsuits from patients' families. So, in this bizarre way, a serial killer was effectively safeguarded by the system. In March 1999, the burn unit of Allentown's Lehigh Valley Hospital was short on night shift nurses, and Charles was successfully hired. There, he murdered one patient and attempted to kill another. Before hospital administrators could fully investigate, Charles resigned for personal reasons and immediately secured a job in the cardiac care unit at St. Luke's Hospital. Over 3 years, Charles killed at least 5 patients and attempted to kill 2 others. In the early hours of January 11, 2000, Charles attempted to kill himself. He moved a small charcoal grill into his bathtub, drew the plastic curtain, and hoped to die from carbon monoxide poisoning. However, neighbors detected the smell of smoke and notified the fire department and police, who intervened and saved Charles. The real breakthrough in the case came in April 2002, when a night shift nurse discovered several medication vials while taking out the trash. Pharmacy records showed these medications had never been logged. Hospital administrators quietly launched an internal audit and found that the person who had taken the drugs was Charles. They gave him 2 options: resign voluntarily with a letter of recommendation to work at another hospital, or be fired with a permanent stain on his record. In June, Charles chose to resign. Shortly after, several colleagues jointly petitioned the Lehigh County District Attorney, suspecting that Charles had used those medications to murder patients. However, the case was dismissed due to lack of direct evidence. After a 3-month break, Charles began working in the critical care unit of the Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. By then, Charles's mental illness had worsened significantly. On June 10, 2003, he injected a bolus of insulin into the foreline of Philip, a 60-year-old retired teacher. Although Philip was resuscitated, he died 6 months later from genuine heart failure. As a result, the hospital only recorded the hypoglycemic incident as an accidental event. In July, hospital administrators discovered that Charles had repeatedly violated protocols. Around the same time, the executive director of the New Jersey Poison Information and Education System warned them that at least 4 suspicious drug overdoses indicated an employee was secretly killing patients. However, it was not until October that the police were notified, after another patient had died unexpectedly. Following the incident, the state's health department urgently retrieved medical records and discovered that similar cases had occurred as early as August but had not been reported. Further investigation traced a pattern spanning many years, with similar deaths occurring at multiple hospitals where Charles had worked. To avoid legal liability, Somerset Medical Center immediately fired Charles, claiming he had lied on his job application and that his actions were unrelated to the hospital itself. On December 12, 2003, Charles was arrested by police at an unassuming restaurant in New Jersey. He was charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. 2 days later, during an interrogation, Charles confessed to the officers the names of 2 victims, stating, "I did it all." He then added, "Over 16 years, about 40 victims, I never kept an exact count." In April 2004, Charles signed 13 guilty pleas for murder and 2 for attempted murder before a judge. As part of the plea agreement, he promised to cooperate with the police in exchange for not being sentenced to death. A month later, feeling that his cooperation had not been thorough enough, he confessed to murdering 3 additional victims. In November, Charles admitted in an Allentown courtroom to killing 6 patients and 3 attempted murders. He also taunted the judge by saying, "Your Honor, you need to step down." On March 2, 2006, Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey, meaning he would not be eligible for parole until 2403. 8 days later, he was brought to Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, where a judge sentenced him to 6 additional life sentences. Today, Charles is still incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. As part of his plea agreement, investigators occasionally visit him to confirm details about additional victims. In the interrogation room, Charles described his motive for murder with a twisted logic that almost sounded compassionate. "I simply couldn't bear to witness or hear attempts to save the victims' lives. I administered overdoses to end their suffering, to prevent hospital staff from tormenting them." But most of his victims were actually in recovery and would soon have been discharged. He then added, "I can't remember clearly. Those years are like a fog." His memory had grown hazy. He could not recall how many he had killed or why he had chosen them. Sometimes, Charles firmly denied committing murders at specific hospitals, but when police presented medical records, he would relent. "It looks like it was me. I'll admit it then." Like a drop of mercury, Charles slid from one hospital to another. Over 16 years, he caused many deaths. In those days, New Jersey and Pennsylvania only required hospitals to report extremely egregious cases of death. But what constituted extremely egregious? It had to be the arrest of the murderer on the spot in the ward, a guilty plea, and a blood test used as evidence. Suspicion, anomalies, and irregularities did not count. In reality, many hospitals vaguely understood what Charles did, but none were willing to risk being sued by the patient's family and report Charles. In the wake of this case, New Jersey passed the Patient Safety Act of 2004, which for the first time mandated the reporting of serious preventable adverse events. In 2005, additional loopholes were closed. Hospitals were now required to retain records of employee complaints, medication errors, and disciplinary actions for 7 years, and synchronize them with a state database. Other states followed suit and established background investigation systems for healthcare practitioners. But the cost of these systematic improvements was paid with the lives of dozens or hundreds of people who can never be brought back.